In the heart of the Rust Belt lies a story few dare to tell, a tale of power, loyalty, and blood that shaped a city's darkest corners for over 7 decades. The Buffalo crime family wasn't just a criminal organization. It was an empire built in shadows, ruled by one man's iron will and a legacy that stretched beyond borders. From secret alliances to violent betrayals, from quiet domination to explosive mob wars, this is the untold saga of the Mafia family that controlled the Falls, and the silent forces still lingering beneath the surface today. Step inside the world where loyalty was law, and every move could be your last. This is the Buffalo crime family. Chapter 1. Roots of the Sicilian bloodline. The winds that blew across the choppy waters of the Mediterranean in the early 20th century carried with them more than the salt of the sea. They carried desperation. They carried dreams. And in the case of a small group of men from the seaside town of Castellammarese del Golfo in western Sicily, they carried a code, one that had been passed down in whispers, in blood, in silence. A code of omerta, of honor, of violence. This was not just immigration. This was the transplantation of an ancient underworld into new soil. And that soil was America. By the time the first wave of Sicilian immigrants began to arrive in Buffalo, New York, the city was a booming industrial powerhouse. Steel, grain, shipping, and railroads had transformed Buffalo into a magnet for labor. It was a place where men could disappear into the smoke of factories and the shadows of dockside saloons. To many, it was a chance to start over. But for a select few, it was an opportunity to rebuild a forgotten empire, this time under the American flag. Among those who made the journey were men like Stefano Magaddino, Pietro Licata, and Joe DiCarlo, names that would, in time, become synonymous with organized power in Western New York. But in those early days, they were just immigrants, laborers, stone-faced men with calloused hands and eyes that had seen more than they ever spoke. They carried the language of Sicily in their voices and the language of La Cosa Nostra in their silence. Castellammarese del Golfo was no ordinary town. It was a cradle of Mafia tradition, a breeding ground for men bound by ancient codes and deadly alliances. It was the birthplace of some of the most influential mob figures in American history, from Salvatore Maranzano to Joseph Bonanno. The town's influence stretched across oceans, weaving itself into the very fabric of American organized crime. And as its sons arrived in Buffalo, they brought more than their labor. They brought their loyalties, their rivalries, and their ghosts. Buffalo in the 1910s and 1920s was a place on the brink. Prohibition was dawning, and with it came opportunity, illegal, intoxicating, and lethal. The city's immigrant communities were tightly clustered, bound by culture, poverty, and survival. Within the Italian neighborhoods, there existed a quiet order, one not enforced by the police, but by men in suits who rarely smiled and always watched. These were the forerunners of the Buffalo crime family. And in the shadows of church steps, and behind the counters of barbershops and bakeries, the old world began to organize itself anew. Secret societies had long existed in southern Italy. The Sicilian Mafia, the Calabrian 'Ndrangheta, the Neapolitan Camorra, each had their own codes, rituals, and hierarchies. When their members came to America, those societies didn't die. They adapted. They evolved. And in Buffalo, the seeds of that adaptation took root beneath a veneer of legitimate life. The early leaders of Buffalo's underworld were cautious, calculating, and almost invisible. They understood that power wasn't loud. It was quiet. It didn't come from bullets. It came from whispers. Influence wasn't about headlines. It was about control. And so they built their empire brick by brick, favor by favor, envelope by envelope. Protection rackets, loan sharking, and gambling dens sprang up behind legitimate fronts. A butcher's shop doubled as a drop point. A tailor's backroom served as a meeting hall. A funeral home became the nerve center of an empire that would one day stretch across borders. But even in those early years, there were rivalries. Not all Italians were allies. The Mafia from Castellammarese del Golfo looked down on the Neapolitans, mistrusted the Calabrians, and barely tolerated the Sicilians from Palermo. The tensions that had plagued southern Italy for centuries found new life in Buffalo's narrow streets. And with the promise of Prohibition, those rivalries would soon turn to blood. The Volstead Act, enacted in 1920, banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol in the United States. For law-abiding citizens, it was a legal constraint. For the underworld, it was a windfall. Suddenly, the men who once struggled to make ends meet hauling coal or fixing shoes found themselves sitting atop a gold mine. Rum running across Lake Erie, speakeasies in the basements of tenement houses, moonshine stills hidden in barns on the outskirts of town. This was the new economy. And the men who controlled it were no longer just immigrants. They were bosses in those formative years. One name began to rise above the rest: Stefano Magaddino. He was quiet, cold, and feared, known as the Undertaker, partly for his legitimate funeral business, but more so for the way men who crossed him ended up in coffins. Magaddino wasn't just a gangster. He was a tactician, a bridge between the old world and the new. And unlike many of his contemporaries, he saw the value in patience, in long games, in alliances forged in silence. But Magaddino did not rise alone. He was part of a network, a brotherhood rooted in Castellammarese. This was not coincidence. It was design. The loyalty between Castellammarese men ran deeper than money, deeper than blood. They trusted each other because they were forged from the same stone, raised under the same sun, scarred by the same wars and betrayals. And so, from the smoke of Buffalo's rail yards and the damp cellars of its immigrant districts, a syndicate emerged. The American Mafia was not yet the polished, boardroom-style institution it would become in the post-war era. It was still raw, violent, and rooted in the streets. The men who led it were not celebrities, they were phantoms. And in Buffalo, those phantoms moved with discipline and purpose. They carved out territory without drawing too much blood. They made money without making noise. They created a system that would endure for decades, not through brutality, but through control. But control always comes at a price. As Magaddino's influence grew, so did the scrutiny. Law enforcement, though underfunded and often corrupt, began to take notice. Local beat cops knew which streets to avoid, which storefronts to leave untouched. And while federal agents had bigger targets, New York City, Chicago, Philadelphia, they couldn't ignore the rising tide in Buffalo forever. The city was becoming more than a waypoint. It was becoming a hub. The Canadian border, just a stone's throw from Buffalo, offered a unique advantage. Liquor flowed down from Ontario and cash flowed back up. Cross-border partnerships were forged, not just with other Italian crews, but with Irish bootleggers, Jewish smugglers, and crooked customs agents. The Buffalo underworld was pragmatic. They didn't care where you came from, only what you could deliver. But even in this melting pot of crime, the Sicilians kept their inner circle tight. The real decisions were made by men who shared a dialect, a birthplace, a code. By the mid-1920s, the foundations of the Buffalo crime family were firmly in place. They had money, they had muscle, they had silence. And at the center of it all stood a man who had crossed an ocean not for freedom, but for dominion. Magaddino understood something that most outsiders never grasped. Power in America didn't come from being seen. It came from being feared. And he had mastered the art of invisibility. The Buffalo crime family would go on to become one of the most quietly powerful mafia organizations in the country. It would influence unions, politics, and business from Western New York to Southern Ontario. But none of it would have been possible without those first footsteps off the ships, without the whispers in backrooms, without the men who brought Sicily with them, not just in their hearts, but in their hands. They were masons of a new underworld, laying bricks beneath the floorboards of a city that never saw them coming. And they weren't done building yet. Chapter 2. The Rise of Stefano Magaddino. He stepped off the boat not as a man seeking freedom, but as a man seeking control. Stefano Magaddino didn't come to America with empty pockets and open dreams. He came with a purpose, a plan, and a name that already carried weight in the dark corners of Sicilian society. The year was 1909, and while most immigrants from Castellamare del Golfo arrived at Ellis Island wide-eyed and hungry, Magaddino arrived with his eyes narrowed, measuring, calculating. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. Men like him had learned long ago that silence was safer than speech, that he first settled in Brooklyn, like so many of his fellow countrymen. But the borough wasn't just a haven for Sicilian immigrants. It was a battleground. The streets of Williamsburg and East New York were thick with tension, divided between old loyalties and new ambition. Small-time hoods and seasoned racketeers jostled for position, but Magaddino moved differently. He didn't seek attention. He sought access. Access to people. Access to information. And most importantly, access to power. It wasn't long before he aligned himself with the emerging Castellammarese faction, men who, like him, came from the rugged coastal hills of western Sicily. These men had grown up on the same cobblestone streets, whispered the same prayers, and shed blood under the same flag. In America, they brought those bonds with them like sacred scripture. And in Brooklyn, that brotherhood found new purpose. Magaddino quickly fell into orbit with Salvatore Maranzano, a fellow Castellammarese who had begun assembling his own base of influence in New York's underworld. Maranzano was a student of Roman history, obsessed with Julius Caesar and the order of empires. He sought to bring structure to chaos, discipline to disarray, and he saw in Magaddino not just an enforcer, but a thinker, a man of discretion, a man who understood that the greatest victories are won long before the battle begins. Their circle expanded with another name that would echo for decades, Giuseppe Bonanno. Young, intelligent, and fiercely loyal, Bonanno saw Magaddino as a bridge between generations. The older man commanded respect without theatrics. He spoke with the finality of a stone dropped into still water. And when he listened, it was with the full weight of judgment. Together, these men formed the nucleus of what would become the Castellammarese clan, a rising force in the shadowy world of organized crime, poised to challenge the old order that had grown fat and arrogant. The time, New York's underworld, was dominated by Joe the Boss Masuria, a brutal and paranoid kingpin who ruled through fear and demanded unquestioning loyalty. But cracks were forming in his empire. He had made enemies among the Sicilians who resented his greed, his ambition, and his betrayal of old-world values. For Magaddino and the Castellammarese, Masuria represented everything they despised: chaos without code, power without purpose. The stage was set for war. In 1930, tensions exploded into what became known as the Castellammarese War, a bloody, street-level civil war between rival mafia factions. Bodies piled up in Brooklyn alleyways. Murders were carried out in broad daylight. And through it all, Stefano Magaddino remained largely in the background, far from the front lines, but deeply involved in the orchestration. He wasn't a street soldier. He was a strategist, a consigliere of sorts, whose voice carried weight even when it wasn't heard. His ability to remain unseen made him invaluable. While Maranzano moved like a general rallying troops, and Bonanno operated as a loyal field captain, Magaddino played the long game. He forged alliances, kept the Castellammarese faction united, and fed information up the chain. He understood that the war wouldn't be won through brute force. It would be won through patience, intelligence, and decisive strikes. And that strike came on April 15, 1931. Joe Masuria was gunned down in a Coney Island restaurant, betrayed by his own allies. It was the turning point that ended the war and shattered the old regime. With Masuria gone, Maranzano declared himself capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses, and attempted to consolidate control over the newly organized families. But Maranzano's reign would be short-lived. Within months, he too was murdered, cut down by men loyal to Charles "Lucky" Luciano, who had grown weary of Maranzano's attempts to cling to absolute power. In the vacuum that followed, a new order emerged: the Commission, a governing body designed to prevent future wars and settle disputes among the families. And among its founding members sat a man whose name had barely appeared in newspapers, but whose influence was undeniable, Stefano Magaddino. While the streets of New York bled, Magaddino made his move north. He relocated to Buffalo, then a booming industrial hub near the Canadian border, and established himself as the uncontested boss of the region. It was a move that puzzled some and terrified others. Why would a man with such deep roots in Brooklyn leave the epicenter of power? The answer was simple: vision. Magaddino saw what others did not. He saw a city rich in opportunity, untouched by the turf wars of New York, and strategically located near Canada, a gateway for smuggling, trafficking, and influence. He didn't want to rule a corner. He wanted to rule a corridor. And in Buffalo, he found the perfect foundation for his empire. He brought with him the old world structure: capos, soldiers, lieutenants, and quietly built a hierarchy that would last for decades. Unlike the flamboyant gangsters of New York or Chicago, Magaddino demanded discretion. He wore simple suits. He spoke in measured tones. And when he gave an order, it was obeyed without question. His nickname, the Undertaker, came from his legitimate funeral home business, but it was also a chilling reflection of his temperament. Cold, patient, final. Under his leadership, the Buffalo crime family grew from a regional outfit into a powerful and respected member of the national syndicate. He established deep ties with the Bonanno family in New York, maintained close communication with the emerging factions in Detroit and Cleveland, and extended his influence into Ontario through alliances with Canadian underworld figures. But his greatest strength was his ability to blend legitimacy with illegality. He didn't just run rackets. He invested in real estate, businesses, and labor unions. He understood that true power wasn't just about fear, it was about control. Control of systems, of people, of narratives. He wasn't in the newspaper because he owned the men who wrote them. He wasn't arrested because he owned the men who enforced the laws. As the 1930s closed and America entered an era of economic turmoil and global war, Magaddino's influence only deepened. He kept a low profile, avoided the showmanship that brought down so many of his peers, and ruled with a hand that was iron beneath velvet. He was not the most famous mafia boss. He was not the most talked about. But among the commission, his word carried the weight of history. For Joe Bonanno, Magaddino remained a mentor and silent partner, though their relationship would sour in the decades to come. For others, he was a relic of the old world, a reminder of a time when loyalty mattered more than money, and silence was worth more than gold. And for the city of Buffalo, he became a ghost king, omnipresent yet unseen. The streets bore his fingerprints, even if they never bore his name. He controlled the docks, the unions, the backrooms of restaurants and nightclubs. And through it all, he stayed out of the spotlight, orchestrating from behind closed doors. Stefano Magaddino was not a man of violence for its own sake. He used fear as a tool, not as a language. He believed in discipline, in order, in longevity. And in a world where most mafia bosses lived fast and died young, he endured. He ruled, quietly, but no kingdom stands forever. Even as his empire grew, cracks were beginning to form. Ambitious men whispered in corners. Younger soldiers questioned the old ways. And across the border in Canada, new players were emerging, ruthless, impatient, and hungry for more. Still, for now, the throne belonged to him. Stefano Magaddino had risen from a Sicilian fishing village to become one of the most powerful mafia dons in American history. Not through bloodshed, not through headlines, but through silence, through patience, through vision. He was the architect of an invisible empire, and he was only getting started. Chapter 3: Castellammarese War and the Commission. It began as a quiet murmur beneath the streets of New York City. A slow, seething tension rising between two factions of men who had once called the same island home. At first, it was just a few suspicious glances across tables, some broken deals, some muffled whispers exchanged in back rooms. But soon, it erupted into a storm of bullets and betrayal. And when it was over, nothing about the American mafia would ever be the same. At the center of this transformation, silent and deliberate as always, stood Stefano Magaddino. The Castellammarese War was not a war in the traditional sense. There were no armies, no flags, no public declarations. It was a war of assassinations, ambushes, and whispered orders, an invisible conflict waged in the alleys and tenements of Brooklyn and Manhattan. It pitted old against new, greed against tradition, and chaos against structure. On one side stood Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masuria, the self-declared ruler of all Mafia factions in America. On the other stood Salvatore Maranzano, a fellow, Sicilian and determined rival, backed by a coalition of men from Castellamare del Golfo. Men like Joe Bonanno, Niccolo Rizzuto, and Stefano Magaddino. Masuria was brash, controlling, and erratic. He demanded unwavering loyalty, not through respect, but through fear. He taxed other bosses, violated old codes, and made reckless enemies. To the Castellammarese faction, led by Maranzano and his circle, Masuria represented a corruption of the old Sicilian order. He was a man drunk on his own power, with no sense of honor or balance. And so, they moved against him, not out of ambition alone, but out of what they believed was necessity. Magaddino's role in the war was not defined by street-level violence. He was not the man kicking in doors or pulling triggers in alleyways. He was something more valuable, a strategist, a mind behind the curtain, a consigliere of war. From Buffalo, he operated with a level of insulation that allowed him to advise without exposure. He coordinated safe houses, moved information between cities, and offered counsel to Maranzano and Bonanno when the weight of battle became too heavy. His home in western New York, just far enough from the carnage, served as a quiet haven for men on the run and a staging ground for decisions that would determine the future of the American underworld. The war stretched from 1930 to early 1931. In that time, over 40 men were murdered, each killing a signal, each death a message. It was a brutal, calculated purge of the old guard. Masuria's men began to fall, gunned down in restaurants, clubhouses, and while walking their routes. The Castellammarese faction was meticulous, patient, and increasingly powerful. With every shot fired, the old empire crumbled. And in the final act of betrayal, Masuria was taken out not by strangers, but by men he believed were loyal to him. On April 15, 1931, Joe Masuria was lured to a restaurant in Coney Island under the guise of a truce. He played cards at a table, unaware that the men around him had already made their decision. Charles Lucky Luciano, once a trusted lieutenant, stepped away from the table. Within seconds, bullets tore through the air. Masuria slumped forward, riddled with holes, his blood staining the white linen of the tablecloth. It was an execution, but more than that, it was a coronation. The old boss was gone. A new era had arrived. With Masuria dead, Maranzano wasted no time. He declared himself Capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. He called a meeting of top mafia figures across the country to lay out a new structure. The families would be organized into units, each with its own boss, underboss, and consigliere. The power structure was designed to mirror the Roman Empire, a hierarchy with Maranzano at the top. He wanted order, discipline, and control, but he also wanted something more dangerous, absolute authority. To men like Luciano, Bonanno, and Magaddino, this was troubling. They had fought to dismantle one tyrant, only to see another rise in his place. Maranzano's obsession with power began to erode the alliances that had secured his victory. He drew up lists of men to be eliminated, fearing betrayal at every turn. And it didn't take long for those fears to become reality. 5 months after Masuria's murder, Maranzano was himself assassinated, stabbed and shot in his own office by a group of hitmen disguised as federal agents. The killing was orchestrated by Luciano, with the quiet blessing of others who had grown wary of Maranzano's rule. It was the second decapitation of a boss within the same year. But this time, there would be no power vacuum. There would be a system. In the aftermath of Maranzano's death, a revolutionary concept was born, the Commission. It was not a monarchy. It was a syndicate. a governing body made up of the heads of the most powerful mafia families in America. They would meet, discuss, and vote on major issues. No more bosses of all bosses. No more unilateral decrees. The commission would ensure stability, prevent wars, and allow each family to manage its own affairs while adhering to shared rules and mutual respect. Stefano Magaddino was not only a founding member of this new commission, he was one of its most respected voices. Representing the Buffalo crime family, he brought a regional power into the national conversation. His inclusion on the commission signaled a recognition that the Mafia's reach extended far beyond New York City and Chicago. Buffalo was no longer a backwater. It was a pillared at the meetings. Magaddino rarely spoke unless he had to. But when he did, others listened. He brought with him decades of old-world experience, a calm mind, and an ability to mediate disputes without ever appearing weak. He wasn't interested in theatrics. He was interested in longevity. And while Luciano became the public face of modern organized crime, Magaddino became its backbone, quiet, steady, and immovable. The commission formalized the Mafia's grip on America. It established the five families of New York: Luciano, later Genovese; Mangano, later Gambino; Prophesy, later Colombo; Bonanno, and Gagliano, later Lucchese. Outside of New York, other powerful families were granted seats at the table: Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, and Buffalo. These weren't just alliances. They were guarantees. They were the infrastructure of a criminal empire that would thrive. For decades, Magaddino used his position on the commission to secure his own territory. He was given authority not only over Buffalo, but also large parts of western New York and access to the Canadian underworld through Ontario. This was a critical corridor for bootlegging and narcotics, and he protected it with relentless focus. While other families made headlines for flash and violence, Magaddino built quietly, creating a network of rackets that stretched from the docks of Buffalo to the streets of Hamilton, Ontario. His influence within the commission was not based on brute force. It was based on respect. He was the old-school Don in a room of younger, flashier men. But they knew better than to dismiss him. He had survived more than most. He had outlived two bosses of bosses, and he had helped build the very system that now protected them all. Through the 1930s, the commission held. Murders decreased. Disputes were settled not with bullets, but with sit-downs. The Mafia became more than an underworld. It became a shadow government. And Magaddino, from his base in Buffalo, became one of its elder statesmen. But peace is never permanent. Beneath the surface, rivalries still simmered. Ambitions still burned. The families cooperated, but they did not forget. And while the commission provided order, it also created targets. The FBI, once dismissive of organized crime, began to take notice. And as the government watched, men like Magaddino made sure their faces remained in shadow. Still, for a time, there was calm. The storm had passed. The Castellammarese War had ended in blood, but out of its chaos rose a structure that would dominate American organized crime for generations. And in that structure, Stefano Magaddino had carved out his place. Not through flash or ferocity, but through foresight. He had survived the war not just with his life, but with his legacy intact. And in the years to come, that legacy would be tested, challenged, and nearly undone. But for now, he was a boss not just of a city, but of an era. The old world had found its footing in the new, and the commission, his quiet creation, was only just beginning. Chapter 4. The Funeral Director's Throne. It was a peculiar kingdom, ruled not from a gilded palace but from a somber chapel draped in silence and grief. In the heart of Buffalo, nestled among snow-covered streets and modest storefronts, Stefano Magaddino built his empire behind the unassuming facade of a funeral home. To the public, he was the grieving man's companion, the silent guardian of last rites. But behind the soft shuffle of mourners and the scent of lilies lay one of the most powerful criminal empires ever to exist outside of New York City. Magaddino understood one fundamental truth about America. It respected discretion. He wasn't flashy like the New York Dons. There were no mink coats or gaudy cigars. No grand entrances or champagne-soaked nights in front of photographers. His power, whispered, not roared. In that whisper was a quiet warning that in Buffalo, nothing happened without his blessing. And if it did, it didn't happen twice. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, while the world above shifted in chaos, from economic collapse to world war, Magaddino's underworld remained anchored by one man's cold logic and meticulous control. The funeral business offered him the perfect cover. Death was constant. Death asked no questions. And in death, Magaddino found a place where the lines between the legitimate and the illicit could blur into a single, quiet enterprise, the Magaddino Memorial Chapel sat on Niagara Street, just a few miles from the Canadian border. It was more than a place for mourners. It was a gatehouse, a nerve center where orders were whispered into the ears of trusted lieutenants and payments passed in envelopes beneath caskets. Coffins didn't just carry bodies. They carried messages, favors, and sometimes the silent remains of enemies. Magaddino's reach extended far beyond the icy sidewalks of Buffalo. His fingers coiled through Ontario, reaching into Toronto and Hamilton, linking with Italian immigrants who saw him not only as a protector, but as a judge. His control crossed borders without needing passports, and the Niagara River became less a boundary than a passageway for bootleg whiskey, stolen goods, and hard men willing to kill for a price. His power came from more than just fear. It came from structure. Under Magaddino, the Buffalo crime family wasn't just a gang. It was a government. There were protocols, chains of command, a code of silence enforced by blood. The family functioned like a machine, with each cog, each soldier, capo, and associate, turning in time with the next. And when one part failed, Magaddino knew how to remove it without stalling the engine. The man himself remained an enigma. To outsiders, he appeared almost monastic, rarely speaking above a murmur, his face carved from granite, his eyes hollow yet watchful. He dressed plainly, favoring dark suits and old shoes. But those closest to him knew that under the austere appearance beat the heart of a man who never forgot a slight and never forgave betrayal. He rarely used the telephone, distrusting it with the paranoia of someone who had survived too long to be careless. Instead, messages were hand-delivered by trusted couriers. Sit-downs were few, but when they happened, they took place in backrooms of butcher shops or in the deep quiet of night, where loyalty was gauged not by words but by the steady calm in a man's eyes. Magaddino had an uncanny ability to see the battlefield 5 moves ahead. He wasn't just reacting to events, he was creating them. By the late 1940s, his name was spoken with respect, even fear, in rooms that spanned the entire northeastern United States. He held a seat on the commission, the Mafia's governing council, not because he sought it, but because it was understood. Without him, the house wouldn't stand. Other families watched Buffalo with curiosity. It wasn't New York or Chicago. It didn't boast skyscrapers or national headlines. But it functioned. It brought in money. It kept order. And most importantly, it didn't bring heat. Federal agents were too busy chasing flashier targets. In Buffalo, Magaddino worked in the shadows, collecting tribute from bookmaking, loan sharking, and union rackets, all without the flair that brought unwanted attention to the community. He remained a ghost of sorts, quiet, respected, always present but never quite seen. He made donations to Catholic churches, sponsored community events, and paid for funerals of the poor. And in those acts of charity lay something darker, a reminder to the neighborhood that Magaddino was always watching, always listening, and always judging who deserved life and who did not. But it wasn't just about money or even power. For Magaddino, control was spiritual. There was something almost religious in his belief in Cosa Nostra. It was not simply an organization. It was a legacy, a code, a sacred fraternity forged in the hills of Sicily and carried across the ocean by men who had nothing but their names and their blood. To violate that code, to bring shame upon it, was to commit the gravest sin. Inside his chapel, beneath the solemn glow of chandeliers, deals were made with nods and glances. If those walls could speak, they would tell stories of alliances formed, rivals silenced, and fortunes made on backs broken beneath the weight of quiet obedience. The Canadian connection became especially vital. The border was a gateway to smuggling routes that fed Buffalo's criminal economy. Whiskey during Prohibition, narcotics in later years, counterfeit goods, and sometimes even people. His partnership with Canadian mob figures solidified Buffalo's place not just as a local family, but as an international player. Magaddino's strength lay not just in his ruthlessness, but in his patience. He knew that fire burned fast, but ice lasted. Where other bosses boasted and flared, he endured. He saw the long game, and that long game meant avoiding the spotlight, avoiding wars, and keeping enemies in check not through open conflict, but by making them irrelevant. That didn't mean he was soft. When necessary, Magaddino sanctioned hits with surgical precision, but he rarely involved himself directly. He kept layers of distance between him and the blade. When a man disappeared in Buffalo, there were no headlines, no parades, just silence. A silence that spoke volumes. In time, Buffalo became a haven for mafiosi on the run, a kind of neutral zone where peace could be brokered. Magaddino's chapel wasn't just a business, it became a sanctuary. Men whispered confessions not of sin, but of strategy. And Magaddino listened, always measured, always calculating. By the mid-1950s, his control had reached its apex. His lieutenants controlled the Teamsters in western New York. Unions in construction, sanitation, and longshoreman trades owed allegiance to his soldiers. Politicians were bribed. Judges looked the other way. And through it all, the man known as the Undertaker remained calm, his face unreadable, his hands folded in quiet calculation. But no empire remains untouched. Whispers began to circulate, of younger capos growing restless, of federal agents sniffing around the docks, of a new generation that didn't believe in the old ways. Magaddino sensed it, the slow wind of change blowing through his chapel doors. But for now, his grip held firm. The Buffalo crime family was not born in fireworks or gunfights. It was born in silence. It grew in the stillness of funeral parlors and the cold air of upstate nights. And at the center of it stood a man who understood death more intimately than any boss before or after. Stefano Magaddino didn't just bury men. He built a kingdom from their bones, and in the quiet corners of Buffalo, where the snow fell heavy and the streets never quite thawed, that kingdom would rule in shadows for decades to come. Chapter 5. Building a Border Empire. As the smoke of war cleared and the Mafia Commission stabilized the underworld across the United States, Stefano Magaddino saw an opportunity others overlooked. Not in New York, not in Chicago, but just across the border. The quiet, windswept towns along the Niagara River, where the waters roared and whispered secrets between two nations, became the next frontier of his empire. This wasn't just about territorial pride. It was about power that transcended borders. And for Magaddino, the frontier between Buffalo, New York, and Ontario, Canada would become the beating heart of a silent empire in the post-Prohibition years, while attention focused on high-profile mob bosses and headline-grabbing hits. Magaddino worked in shadows. His funeral parlor in Buffalo provided him the perfect cover. No one questioned a grieving undertaker. No one suspected that among the bodies of the dead, silent messages were passed, money was counted, and orders were given. But as the Buffalo boss grew older, he turned his eyes northward, to Canada. With a cold, calculating focus, Canada was ripe. Unlike the heavily saturated criminal territories of the American cities, Canada's underworld was fragmented, disorganized. It had its bootleggers, its gamblers, its petty crooks. But it lacked leadership. It lacked the brutal efficiency that men like Magaddino brought with them. And most importantly, it lacked the Commission's reach. That, to Magaddino, meant opportunity. Niagara Falls wasn't just a tourist attraction. It was a gateway, a loophole, a smuggler's dream. The border crossing at the falls became one of the most valuable criminal corridors in North America. Magaddino moved slowly, carefully. He didn't send soldiers with guns. He sent whispers. He sent emissaries. He partnered with local hoods, offering them protection in exchange for obedience. And those who refused simply vanished into the mist. Over time, criminal operations sprouted like weeds in Niagara Falls, St. Catharines, and Toronto. Gambling dens opened in the basements of corner shops. Heroin shipments arrived in false-bottomed crates. Money laundering fronts operated as legitimate businesses. And all of it fed back to Buffalo. By the late 1940s, the Buffalo crime family's reach extended well into southern Ontario. They weren't just taking a cut, they were running the show. Local law enforcement often turned a blind eye, either out of fear or for the right price. But behind the veneer of small-town normalcy, a powerful machine was turning. Drug routes stretched from Montreal to Detroit, passing through Buffalo with chilling precision. Shipments of narcotics, mostly heroin and morphine, were smuggled from Europe, funneled into Montreal, and then across the Niagara border under the cloak of legitimate trade. It was a system built on silence. The men who handled the drugs never saw the bosses. The couriers never knew their paymasters. But they all feared the same name, Stefano Magaddino. He rarely raised his voice. He didn't need to. His presence lingered in every barroom whisper, in every envelope of cash, in every closed casket rolling out of his funeral home. In Canada, Magaddino relied on a network of lieutenants, mostly Sicilian transplants who knew the rules of omerta. Men like Johnny Papalia in Hamilton and Paul Volpe in Toronto would later rise through these ranks. But in these early years, they played small roles. The real architect of Canadian operations was Magaddino himself. He didn't just manage a family. He oversaw an ecosystem. And like a patient gardener, he nurtured its growth with ruthless efficiency. But what made this expansion so brilliant wasn't just geography. It was strategy. By controlling a binational operation, Magaddino created redundancy. If heat came down in Buffalo, operations shifted to Canada. If Toronto got hot, the family retreated to the States. Law enforcement, hamstrung by jurisdictional limitations and bureaucratic red tape, struggled to keep pace. The FBI couldn't operate across the border. The RCMP had limited visibility into American networks. And Magaddino exploited that gap. With surgical precision, revenue flowed like water through the falls. Gambling brought in tens of thousands weekly. Drug profits surged, especially as heroin became the drug of choice for urban addicts in the 50s. And with every dollar laundered, the Buffalo boss cemented his legacy as more than just a regional figure. He became an international power, a man whose influence crossed borders and defied governments. In time, his reach stretched further still. Connections were established with Montreal's Calabrian networks, and later, the Catroni family. These alliances weren't just about profits, they were about control. Magaddino ensured that nothing moved in Canada without his blessing. From narcotics to numbers, from gambling parlors to the trucking unions, the shadow of Buffalo loomed large. But Magaddino's genius also lay in his invisibility. While other bosses flashed their wealth in suits and Cadillacs, Magaddino lived modestly. He rarely made public appearances. His phone was never tapped. His name was often omitted from police reports out of ignorance or fear, and that discretion protected him. The border empire wasn't built on violence. It was built on discipline, structure, and fear. By the early 1950s, Buffalo had become more than a backwater crime family. Under Magaddino, it evolved into a command center for cross-border crime. Its reach rivaled that of larger families in Detroit and Chicago. And yet, few outside of law enforcement circles even knew the full extent of its power. That was by design. In a world where attention brought indictments, Magaddino chose shadows. And in those shadows, he built something formidable. The commission took note. While he wasn't as vocal as Luciano or as flashy as Costello, Magaddino held one of the 13 seats at the table. And when decisions were made about territory, policy, or punishment, the quiet boss from Buffalo was always consulted. His Canadian interests gave the commission leverage across an entire international corridor. And Magaddino, ever the strategist, used that leverage to shape policy, broker peace, and expand influence. Not every boss liked it. Tensions simmered with the Bananos, who also had interests in Montreal. Detroit's partnership kept a wary eye on their northern neighbors. But Magaddino, careful as ever, avoided open conflict. He knew power wasn't taken with fists, it was taken with patience. Through the 1950s and into the early 60s, the border empire grew bolder. New rackets were introduced: loan sharking, counterfeit operations, even control over cargo. Shipping routes. Teamsters were brought under control. Trucking unions in Buffalo and southern Ontario fell in line. And with that control came dominance over import-export businesses, giving Magaddino's crew the ability to smuggle virtually anything: narcotics, stolen goods, even weapons, across the invisible, ever-porous border. But success bred jealousy. Inside his own family, younger members grew restless. They saw the wealth flowing into Buffalo and wanted more. Magaddino, aging and increasingly distant, ruled with an iron fist. Promotions came slowly. Dissent was punished. And the seeds of future rebellion were quietly planted beneath the surface of his empire. Still, in these golden years, Magaddino was at the height of his power. He wasn't just the boss of Buffalo. He was the architect of a criminal corridor that stretched from the streets of Hamilton to the alleys of Buffalo, from the port of Montreal to the riverfront docks of Niagara. He controlled unions, judges, mayors, and he did it without ever raising a gun. His empire was a quiet one, but it was vast. And it was real. Behind every casino chip, every envelope of cash, every whispered threat in a barroom corner, was the invisible hand of Stefano Magaddino, the undertaker turned kingpin, the border czar of America's silent empire. And as his empire thrived in the shadows, few could have imagined the storm that would one day rise from within. For even the most disciplined empires, in time, crack under the weight of ambition, betrayal, and blood. Chapter 6. The Canadian Connection, Papalia, and Beyond. By the 1950s, the reach of the Buffalo crime family had quietly but firmly crossed international boundaries. What began as a regional stronghold in western New York was now becoming a transnational force. Stefano Magaddino, ever the quiet tactician, had laid the foundation for one of the most enduring alliances in North American organized crime, one that would extend deep into the heart of Ontario, Canada. At the center of this alliance stood a man as feared and respected in Canada as Magaddino was in the States, Johnny Papalia. Together, they would build an unshakable criminal corridor from Buffalo to Hamilton, bridging cultures, currencies, and codes of silence. Johnny Papalia was a different kind of gangster, not the brash, flamboyant kind that drew attention like a magnet. He was methodical, ruthless, and deeply tied to his Sicilian roots. Born in Hamilton, Ontario, in 1924 to Calabrian immigrants, he entered the underworld early, drawn by the rhythms of power and the profits of vice. Papalia had no patience for spectacle. His was the language of discipline, loyalty, and quiet force, traits that immediately caught the attention of Stefano Magaddino. The two men never needed grand meetings or dramatic pledges. Their alliance was forged in shadows, in handshakes behind closed doors, and in a mutual understanding of how business should be done. Hamilton, often dismissed as just another steel town, was in fact a jewel in the criminal underworld. Nestled between Toronto and Niagara Falls, it was a perfect logistical pivot point. Trains, trucks, and smuggled cargo moved in and out with little oversight. Corruption ran beneath the surface, not in the kind of obvious ways that made headlines, but in more insidious forms: favors granted, files lost, inspections delayed. The Papalia crew exploited this expertly, and Buffalo's blessing gave them power few could challenge. But this wasn't just about territory. The bond between the two crime families was ideological: a shared code of silence, an old-world respect for hierarchy, and a deep disdain for the flashy American-style mafia that was beginning to emerge elsewhere. Papalia was traditional in every sense. He didn't tolerate drug use among his men. He demanded obedience. He ran gambling dens, loan sharking operations, and protection rackets with brutal efficiency. His hand was felt in every bar, nightclub, and trucking route across southern Ontario, and he answered to no one, except, perhaps, Magaddino. The heart of the Buffalo-Hamilton connection was trust. It was rare in that world, and even rarer across national lines. But Magaddino saw in Papalia a kindred spirit, a younger version of himself, shrewd, low profile, and utterly committed to the life. With Magaddino's backing, Papalia's operations flourished. He became the undisputed boss of Hamilton and, by extension, Canada's most powerful mafia figure. His influence spread into Toronto, Montreal, and even into the American Midwest. And while his name was feared, it was also respected, even by law enforcement who often knew his name but could never make charges stick. Magaddino, for his part, never meddled directly in Canadian affairs. That was the beauty of the arrangement. He offered protection, coordination, and access to larger networks in the United States, drug pipelines, counterfeit operations, and laundering mechanisms that extended far beyond Buffalo. In return, Papalia ensured that the northern flank of the Buffalo crime family remained secure and profitable. Money flowed both ways, but the lines of power remained clear. Hamilton belonged to Papalia, but Hamilton, too, was part of Magaddino's wider kingdom. It wasn't just business that tied them together. The Magaddino and Papalia families were deeply interwoven through marriages, friendships, and shared bloodlines reaching back to Italy. In many ways, it was less an alliance than a family extension, as if Hamilton was simply another outpost of the old Sicilian way of life. And that's how they ran things. Omerta, the code of silence, was sacred. Violators disappeared. Police informants were identified and neutralized. No one crossed them without consequences. One of the most lucrative aspects of the cross-border connection was heroin. As demand skyrocketed in the post-war years, so did opportunity. Buffalo became a key node in the pipeline, with Hamilton serving as both a stash point and a distribution hub. Couriers moved dope through remote crossings, sometimes hidden in car panels, other times stashed in cargo shipments labeled as machine parts. Bribed officials looked the other way. If a package went missing, someone paid, in blood or money. Still, neither Magaddino nor Papalia were reckless. They understood that heat brought headlines, and headlines brought investigations. Their operations were slow, careful, and heavily compartmentalized. In the era of J. Edgar Hoover and increasing federal scrutiny, this level of discipline became a kind of armor. They didn't just avoid detection, they made themselves invisible. By the early 1960s, the Buffalo-Hamilton axis had become a model of criminal efficiency. It wasn't just a partnership, it was a borderless empire. And yet, to outsiders, there was almost nothing to see. Magaddino kept up the appearance of a quiet funeral director. Papalia, often seen strolling casually through the streets of Hamilton, wore suits and rarely raised his voice. They lived among the people, even as they operated above them. There were moments when the alliance faced pressure, from upstart Canadian factions, from American law enforcement, from internal tensions. But nothing seemed to shake the foundation. The commission in New York recognized Magaddino's influence and deferred to his decisions when it came to Canadian affairs. And Papalia, for all his autonomy, never made a major move without Buffalo's knowledge. It was a delicate balance, one maintained through loyalty, money, and the ever-present threat of violence. Violence, when it came, was surgical. A rival was found in a ditch. A talkative associate vanished. A business owner who failed to pay protection woke up to find his storefront in ashes. But these incidents were rare. The true genius of the Buffalo-Papalia connection wasn't in its brutality, it was in its invisibility. They ruled without needing to show it. Power didn't have to announce itself. It simply was. The 1960s brought new challenges. The world was changing. Surveillance was improving. Wiretaps were legal. Borders were tightening. And yet, the alliance held. It adapted. Smuggling routes evolved. New players were brought in, trained in the old ways. The code was preserved, sometimes violently, always vigilantly. Behind it all stood two men, one in a dark office in Buffalo, surrounded by funeral wreaths and ledgers, the other in Hamilton, leaning quietly against a storefront, watching his city move around him. They didn't need titles. They didn't chase fame. But together, they controlled more territory, more money, and more silence than most crime families could ever imagine. The Canadian connection wasn't just a footnote in the history of the Buffalo crime family. It was one of its strongest legs, a transnational extension of a philosophy rooted in secrecy, discipline, and unrelenting control. The Papaleo alliance proved that borders were meaningless to men who understood power. And through this corridor of corruption and loyalty, Magaddino ensured that his reach would stretch not only across state lines, but across nations, into a future shaped by men who said little, trusted few, and ruled absolutely. Chapter 7. The Silent Power of Magaddino. In the quiet streets of Buffalo, his name was rarely spoken, but his presence was everywhere. He didn't need to parade in limousines, nor did he require gilded office suites. Stefano Magaddino wielded power like a shadow, unseen, uncelebrated, yet impossible to ignore. His domain was built on discipline, fear, and an unwavering command that demanded respect through silence. This was not a reign of flamboyant violence. It was a reign of quiet. Authority to understand Magaddino's power is to understand restraint wielded as strength. He refused to indulge the vanity of spectacle. Yes, he had influence over docks, gambling, unions, but he avoided the spotlight. He never appeared in news headlines, never purchased multiple properties in his own name, and never flashed cash on the streets. Instead, he invested in modest storefronts, funeral homes, and trusts. He knew attention invited investigation, so he remained as calm as a still pond. Yet beneath its surface, currents moved thousands of feet deep. His control extended far beyond the reach of police scanners. Men in the Buffalo crime family learned early that loyalty was not optional. It was etched into their lives. Discipline in his organization took no excuses. One misstep, misplaced word, faulty promise, or untended obligation, and the consequences came swiftly. Not as headlines, but as absences. Men disappeared. Witnesses turned silent. The message was clear: dishonor the code, and you cease to exist. In boardrooms of meatpacking plants, in union offices, in dim back rooms of restaurants. His influence was omnipresent. He orchestrated deals without sitting at the table. His orders were delivered through lieutenants who feared him more than jail. There was no need for trophies on walls. His men wore expressions of solemn pride. The collective anxiety of a whisper could make a man tremble. And it came not from bombs or bullets, but from the certainty that Magaddino's reach was equal to any threat to his family. He was both father and executioner. He encouraged enterprise, gambling rooms, loan sharking, smuggling operations, but he insisted that operations remained invisible. He reinforced strict capability, plausible deniability, and unwavering loyalty. Soldiers were trained to avoid arrest. Capos were taught to fix problems before they could be reported. And those who couldn't manage were quietly removed, exiled, frightened, or if needed, buried without fanfare. Fear is not always flash. In the empire Magaddino built, fear was patient. It crept through rumors of late-night visits, of thrifted suits, of ashtrays left undisturbed. Opponents dreaded confrontation because defeat always arrived without warning. He communicated through consequence, not chaos. A gambler found dead in his car, a shopkeeper's storefront unexpectedly burned. These were small notes on a message, and the message never needed to go any further. Even his lieutenants, men hardened by life in the underworld, spoke of him with careful awe. They spoke of afternoon appointments in funeral homes, of soft-spoken conversations that ended in tire disputes. A quiet pause, a measure of silence, and a nod was enough to shift loyalties on both sides of the border. Disagreements were settled discreetly, with 0 witnesses. And once settled, they stayed settled. The Magaddino's reputation extended beyond Buffalo. Within the commission, his opinion was considered law. He never demanded attention, others deferred to him. When he spoke, younger bosses listened, older ones nodded. There was no need to show force when legitimacy was granted. His role had evolved from underworld warlord to elder statesman. His decisions shaped agreements, brokered peace, and preserved territorial boundaries. Yet beneath this calm surface, the machinery of enforcement remained sharp. He kept tight control over the murder teams, over the blacklist of informants, over the quiet exits. He kept his men away from sensationalist violence. He preferred a clean strike, a broken allegiance, a controlled removal. And his operatives were selected not for brutality, but for efficiency. They were ghosts, not gladiators, silent operators, who carried out orders and vanished without trace. One night in 1958, a suspected thief was taken from a roadside bar. He never returned. The FBI noted a disappearance. Locals whispered he owed money. His family distraught in disbelief. No proof, no signs, no charges, no admissions. Just absence. Justice served. Completion. The system worked, and no alarm was raised. In this way, Magaddino taught discipline not by lectures, but by consequence. Internally, he structured his family not like feudal lords, but like a corporation. He handled personnel decisions via direct aides. He managed finances through trusted accountants and lawyers. Money entered the funeral home, the warehouses, the union coffers. It moved through the family's pockets, not his. He was insulated, untouchable. Investigators chased envelopes. Whereas he controlled the flow, respect was not earned through generosity, either. While he made charitable donations, churches, orphanages, there was always a ledger attached. Each donation was matched by loyalty. Each check reinforced the message, you are seen. And if you betray me, remember, I see more than you imagine. The eyes of Magaddino were everywhere, even if he appeared seldom. Even within Canada, his silent power resonated. Papalia acted in deference. Smaller operators deferred to Papalia, and Papalia deferred to Buffalo. The power drain was subtle. It came through nods in dark rooms, through front-page names never associated with the real decisions. When turf was divided in Hamilton or Toronto, Magaddino's influence was indirectly felt, rarely challenged. What happens to power when time passes? Magaddino aged. His hair thinned, his voice grew softer. But power in silence is not diminished by time. It is sharpened, like fine steel kept in oil. He took fewer meetings. He sent fewer messengers. He didn't attend receptions or conferences, but the decisions still passed through him. And if needed, he would convene, quietly, privately, over a brandy in a funeral home office, reading the thin morning paper as sparks flickered in the hearth. But the world changed. FBI wiretaps became federal procedure. Canadian authorities grew more sophisticated. Younger men, influenced by media and ego, began to show their faces too close to the street. Some questioned the old ways. Why not challenge rivals? Why not expand publicly? But every attempt drew swift censure. A shop burned. A gambling den raided. A senior capo exiled. They learned early. Pictures weren't needed. They knew not to show eyes, not to call the boss by name. They knew not to speak that I in this environment. Buffalo remained a model of underworld restraint. While Detroit erupted in violence, while New York's families battled headlines, Buffalo thrived in calm. Respect and fear were internal currencies. They were not public spectacles. And for decades, authorities remained dazed, bewildered by efficiency without evidence. By the late 1960s, cracks appeared. Some younger men began to resent the caution. They wanted more influence, more control, more exposure. They chafed at invisibility. But Magaddino, his mind as sharp as ever, warned that a single high-profile act could undo decades. The family must endure. The mission must persist. He was wise to the seductive glare of notoriety. He had lived long enough to see others fall. By taking shortcuts, hosting celebrations, attracting cameras. He had survived longer than most, because he never sought that spotlight that he continued. Funeral homes remained the front. Union offices remained the cover. The poisoned competitors were ausculted discreetly. The police continued not to connect dots. The FBI grew frustrated. And within the underworld, legends of his power were told in barrooms over gin and whiskey. He was described as a spirit, a ghost king, a whisper that forced confession, but power, even when secret, demands upkeep. And as the 7th chapter closed, the world on both sides of the border was beginning to catch up. Changes in law, in surveillance, in immigration. New blood threatened the old. But Magaddino remained standing, perhaps not as loud as before, but still in command, still commanding respect, still feared, because real power doesn't demand an audience. It demands structure. It demands control. It demands legacy. And in Buffalo, at that moment, Stefano Magaddino's silent throne remained solid, his iron-fisted rule concealed behind calm eyes and folded hands. A power built on quiet, and destined to leave echoes long after it faded. Chapter 8. Allies and Rivals on the Commission. The Mafia Commission was not a mere gathering of crime bosses. It was a shadow government, an elite council that orchestrated the violent symphony of organized crime across America. Within its concealed chambers, decisions were made that shaped the fortunes and fates of millions. Here, alliances were forged, rivalries born, and power balanced on the thinnest of threads. At this clandestine table, Stefano Magaddino held a seat whose influence grew steadily, quietly, yet unmistakably. Though Buffalo was a smaller city compared to New York or Chicago, Magaddino's reputation rivaled the mightiest dons. He was neither flamboyant nor outspoken, but his presence demanded respect. His voice, when raised, carried the weight of decades. His silence, the threat of consequence. This was a man who understood that power was not won by volume or spectacle, but through patience, discipline, and unwavering control. The commission included some of the most notorious figures in American organized crime, men like Vito Genovese, Joseph Bonanno, and Carlo Gambino. Each commanded vast empires and harbored ambitions that could alter the delicate balance of power. Among these giants, Magaddino was a steady force, a constant reminder of the old Sicilian values that underscored the Mafia's existence: loyalty, honor, and secrecy. Vito Genovese was a formidable adversary and, at times, a cautious ally. Known for his aggressive tactics and his unrelenting quest for dominance in New York, Genovese was the embodiment of a modern, brazen mafia boss. His style was confrontational, often marked by brazen violence and public displays of strength. Magaddino, in contrast, was the embodiment of subtlety and patience. The two men rarely clashed openly, but beneath the veneer of politeness lay a tension born from competing visions of power. Genovese sought to consolidate control over all New York families, and his ambitions often put him at odds with other bosses, including Magaddino. Yet, neither sought a war that could decimate their mutual interests. Instead, they engaged in a tacit dance, careful negotiations, veiled threats, and silent agreements crafted behind closed doors. In this dance, Magaddino's measured demeanor served him well. While others wielded their power like weapons, he used his influence like a scalpel, cutting precisely where it mattered most. Joseph Bonanno, another towering figure at the commission, was both an ally and a competitor to Magaddino. Their connection was forged long before the commission's creation, rooted in shared Sicilian heritage and the bloody struggles of the Castellammarese War. Bonanno's family was known for its blend of tradition and adaptability, a reflection of its boss's personality. Where Magaddino was reserved, Bonanno was more approachable, yet no less ruthless. Their alliance was pragmatic. Bonanno recognized Magaddino's strength as a stabilizing force in the often turbulent world of organized crime, while Magaddino valued Bonanno's influence in New York and his ability to command loyalty. Together, they formed a quiet bloc within the commission, one that often counterbalanced the more aggressive ambitions of bosses like Genovese. Carlo Gambino, whose rise would later redefine the mafia landscape, was another pivotal figure in commission politics. Gambino was a man of few words but immense influence. His approach to power was similar to Magaddino's in its subtlety and focus on business-like efficiency. While Gambino concentrated his efforts on New York's expanding rackets, he respected Magaddino's control over Western New York and the Canadian border, often deferring to the older boss's authority in that sphere. Within the meetings of the commission, Magaddino's reputation as a mediator grew. Disputes between families, over territory, resources, or business ventures, were frequent. Yet, it was Magaddino who often brokered peace, his quiet authority bringing resolution without bloodshed. His ability to balance competing interests, to listen before speaking, and to act only when necessary, made him indispensable. The commission was also a theater of shifting loyalties and veiled rivalries. Underneath the formalities, whispered conversations and clandestine deals shaped the future. Magaddino's growing influence was not just a matter of personal strength, but a testament to his ability to navigate this complex landscape. He understood that in this world, the greatest weapon was patience. One of the most contentious issues that stirred debate within the commission was the question of narcotics trafficking. The Mafia's unwritten rules forbade involvement in drugs, a business seen as dangerous and destabilizing. However, the immense profits tempted many families to push the boundaries. Bonanno and Genovese were among those who sought to lift the ban, advocating for controlled narcotics operations to boost their empires. Magaddino approached the matter with caution. He understood the lure of the narcotics trade, but he also foresaw the heightened law enforcement attention it would draw. His operations along the Canadian border were particularly vulnerable to infiltration and seizure. Consequently, he opposed the liberalization of drug trafficking within the commission, arguing that it risked unraveling decades of carefully maintained secrecy and discipline. His stance frustrated some younger bosses eager to expand into the heroin trade, but his experience commanded respect. He was a voice of reason amid the escalating pressures of modern criminal enterprise, a reminder that survival often depended on knowing when to say no. Magaddino's influence was bolstered by his control over labor unions and construction rackets, vital economic levers that extended his power beyond traditional crime circles. The ability to shut down ports, redirect contracts, or influence political elections gave him a form of leverage that few could match. These nonviolent tools of power were as effective as any hitman's bullet. Despite his growing prominence, Magaddino remained a man of few words in commission meetings. He did not seek the spotlight or personal glory. Instead, he wielded influence through thoughtful intervention and quiet counsel. His presence was felt in the pauses, the nods, and the measured responses. Others spoke loudly, but Magaddino's silence often said more. To his rivals, he was a puzzle, respected, sometimes feared, but always enigmatic. He held power not because he was the loudest or most violent, but because he was consistent. Decades of unbroken control gave him an authority that could not easily be challenged. As the 1960s unfolded, the Mafia faced mounting pressures from law enforcement, social change, and internal divisions. The commission itself was strained by competing ambitions and new challenges. Yet, through it all, Magaddino remained a stabilizing figure, a bastion of the old order in an evolving underworld. His legacy within the commission was one of resilience and quiet strength. He embodied the principle that true power often operates unseen, shaping events from the shadows rather than the center stage. In the delicate balance of Mafia politics, Stefano Magaddino was a cornerstone, a man whose influence shaped not only Buffalo but the entire landscape of organized crime in North America. Chapter 9. Control over the labor unions. In the shadowed corridors of power, where decisions shaped the fate of cities and industries, Stefano Magaddino found his greatest leverage, not through bullets, but through labor. The unions of Buffalo and Southern Ontario were more than organizations of workers. They were the arteries through which the lifeblood of commerce flowed. To control the unions was to control the construction cranes that pierced the sky, the ships that glided through the Great Lakes, and the contracts that filled pockets both legitimate and illicit. This was the domain where Magaddino's influence grew unchallenged, where the quiet hand of the Buffalo crime family manipulated the gears of industry with unmatched precision. It'd be why the 1940s and 1950s, labor unions had become pivotal institutions. In North America, wielding unprecedented power, they could halt entire industries with a strike, dictate terms to employers, and sway political elections through their members' votes. For Magaddino, infiltrating these unions was not merely a business opportunity, it was a strategic necessity. It provided an impenetrable shield for his empire and a formidable weapon against rivals and law enforcement alike. The infiltration began subtly. Union halls, once bastions of working-class solidarity, gradually became extensions of the Mafia's reach. Trusted associates, many of them lifelong friends or relatives, secured positions as union stewards, business agents, or officials. These men walked a tightrope, publicly champions of workers' rights, privately enforcers of Magaddino's will. Their presence ensured that union decisions aligned seamlessly with the family's interests. In Buffalo, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters was a prime target. The docks, where goods flowed from ships to warehouses, represented a vital choke point. Controlling the longshoremen meant controlling the flow of merchandise and, more importantly, the contraband hidden among it. Smuggling operations, whether narcotics or counterfeit goods, relied on the complicity of these workers, whose silence was bought with promises and threats in equal measure. But the influence extended beyond the docks. The Building Trades Council, representing carpenters, electricians, plumbers, and laborers, fell under the family's sway. Construction projects across western New York became platforms for extortion, kickbacks, and money laundering. Contractors unwilling to pay their dues found their projects mysteriously delayed, their work crews mysteriously reassigned, or their equipment sabotaged. The invisible hand of the Buffalo family ensured that only those who complied prospered. Magaddino's reach crossed borders. In Ontario and Quebec, labor unions faced similar infiltration. Canadian authorities struggled to unravel the complex web of corruption, often stymied by jurisdictional challenges and the code of silence that protected the family's operatives. The Hamilton and Toronto docks, vital for trade between the United States and Canada, were no exception. Through alliances with the Papalia family and other Canadian criminal elements, Magaddino extended his control across the Niagara River, creating a seamless criminal network that spanned nations. The ability to influence unions granted the Buffalo family more than economic power. It gave them political capital. Local politicians, dependent on union endorsements and campaign contributions, often turned a blind eye to the Mafia's grip. In some cases, they became willing accomplices, their offices used to shield illicit activities or facilitate government contracts. This confluence of organized crime, labor, and politics formed a symbiotic relationship, each reinforcing the other, each benefiting from the unspoken agreement. Magaddino's dominance over unions also served as a barrier against law enforcement. Corrupt police officials and union leaders passed information, sabotaged investigations, and ensured indictments rarely stuck. Investigators found themselves hamstrung by missing witnesses, destroyed evidence, and a community unwilling to talk. Fear and loyalty created an invisible fortress around the family's operations. Yet, the family's control was not without challenges. Internal disputes over union leadership sometimes erupted into violence. Rival factions sought to wrest control of lucrative positions, leading to whispered threats and occasional bloodshed. Magaddino's role as arbiter was crucial in maintaining peace and preserving the family's monopoly. His ability to broker settlements, often behind closed doors, kept the internal machinery running smoothly. Despite the inherent violence lurking beneath the surface, the Buffalo family's approach to union control emphasized subtlety. Instead of overt confrontation, they favored infiltration, influence, and gradual domination. This allowed them to maintain a veneer of legitimacy and avoid the media attention that had brought down other mafia factions. The union rackets were Also a significant revenue stream, fueling other criminal enterprises. Funds from extorted contractors, union dues skimmed under the table, and payoffs from businesses dependent on union labor flowed into the family's coffers. These resources financed gambling operations, loan sharking, narcotics trafficking, and the expansion of the family's territorial control. Control over unions also provided the family with strategic intelligence. Inside information on construction projects, shipment schedules, and political developments gave them an edge over competitors and law enforcement. The ability to anticipate actions allowed Magaddino to plan moves carefully, avoiding unnecessary risk. As decades passed, the family's grip on the unions deepened, becoming part of Buffalo's economic fabric. Efforts by federal authorities to dismantle these networks faced enormous obstacles. Labor leaders involved in corruption maintained legitimate fronts, complicating prosecutions. Witnesses feared retaliation, and the code of silence remained steadfast. Yet, beneath this surface of control, the world was changing. Federal investigations intensified in the 1960s and 1970s, fueled by new laws and dedicated task forces. The public became more aware of mafia infiltration into unions, leading to demands for reform. Despite these pressures, Magaddino's family held firm, adapting their methods to evade detection. In this complex web of labor influence, the Buffalo crime family demonstrated a unique mastery. They transformed unions from independent entities into tools of power, silent weapons that shaped industry, politics, and crime alike. This chapter of their story reveals how control over the working class was not only a means to wealth, but a cornerstone of the family's enduring strength. As the sun set over the steel mills and shipping yards, the unseen hand of Stefano Magaddino moved decisively, ensuring that every brick laid, every shipment unloaded, and every contract signed was touched by the legacy of the Buffalo crime family. Chapter 10. War in the Shadows. The Mafia's world was one of coded loyalty, unspoken alliances, and fragile trust. Beneath the veneer of brotherhood, however, simmered a current of suspicion and rivalry, especially between the Buffalo crime family and their once close allies, the Bananos of New York. What had begun as a partnership forged in shared heritage and mutual benefit gradually transformed into a silent war, a war fought not with open gunfire, but with whispered accusations, strategic betrayals, and mounting tension that threatened to unravel decades of uneasy cooperation. Stefano Magaddino and Joseph Bonanno had shared a bond rooted in their common Sicilian bloodline and the crucible of the Castellammarese War. For years, their families maintained a careful equilibrium, supporting each other's ventures across state lines and backing each other in the violent chessboard of the American underworld. But the shifting tides of power, greed, and ambition slowly eroded this foundation. By the late 1960s, the once solid alliance began to fracture under pressure. The heart of the discord lay competition for control over territories, over narcotics routes, over lucrative rackets that promised wealth beyond measure. The Bananos, younger and more aggressive, sought to expand their influence, pushing into areas long controlled by Magaddino's men. These incursions were not met with open warfare, but with icy silence and calculated retaliation. The Buffalo family, led by Magaddino's iron hand, responded with subtle but unmistakable resistance, blocking contracts, undermining shipments, and quietly encouraging dissent among Bonanno associates. Whispers of betrayal began to circulate. In a world governed by omerta, the code of silence, even rumors were dangerous weapons. It was said that some within the Bonanno ranks were trading secrets, leaking information to the Buffalo family, or worse, planning to defect entirely. Trust dissolved, replaced by paranoia. Meetings between the two families became terse, laced with veiled threats and cautious glances. The shared history that once bound them was overshadowed by suspicion. Inside the Buffalo family, tensions rose as well. Some capos questioned Magaddino's reluctance to strike openly, advocating for more aggressive action against the Bananos. Others feared that escalating conflict could invite unwanted law enforcement attention, jeopardizing the family's hard-won stability. Magaddino's response was characteristic: calm, measured, but resolute. He believed that open war was a luxury the family could ill afford. Instead, he preferred to fight in the shadows, where blows could be struck without fanfare or public spectacle. The conflict was further complicated by the presence of informants and internal dissent. The Mafia's greatest threat was often from within, and both families grappled with betrayal. Whispers of cooperating witnesses reached Magaddino's ears, fueling his distrust. Paranoia deepened. Innocent men were accused, alliances shattered. The delicate balance of power teetered on the edge of collapse. Among the shadows, violent incidents punctuated the uneasy peace. Gunshots in the dead of night. Disappearances that left families grieving and questions unanswered. These acts were seldom publicized, designed to send warnings without igniting full-scale war. Each event tightened the noose around the relationships that once promised solidarity. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies watched intently. The FBI, the Bureau of Narcotics, and local police forces sought to exploit the fissures, hoping to turn one faction against another. Undercover agents infiltrated union meetings and social clubs, gathering evidence that would later form the basis of sweeping indictments. The pressure mounted on both families, making their secret war even more precarious. The media, too, began to catch wind of the discord. Investigative journalists pieced together stories of shifting allegiances and internal strife. Public perception of the Mafia evolved, from romanticized figures of old-world chivalry to ruthless power brokers engaged in a deadly game. This scrutiny forced the families to operate with greater caution, further pushing their battles into the shadows. Despite the escalating conflict, moments of pragmatism persisted. At rare commission meetings, emissaries from both sides met under strict protocols, negotiating temporary truces and dividing territories to prevent open bloodshed. These negotiations were fraught with tension and mistrust, but they underscored a mutual understanding. Full-scale war would be catastrophic for all involved as the 1970s dawned. The war in the shadows defined the Buffalo crime family's struggle to maintain dominance amid a changing landscape. Stefano Magaddino's leadership was tested as never before, navigating the twin threats of internal betrayal and external aggression. His strategy, rooted in patience, discipline, and secrecy, would determine whether the family survived the growing storm or was consumed by in this clandestine conflict. Power was wielded in whispers and glances, in unseen moves and calculated silences. The war was invisible to most, but its consequences echoed through the streets of Buffalo and beyond, shaping the destiny of a family, a city, and a criminal empire built on shadows. Chapter 11. The Narcotics Pipeline. The underworld, as much as it thrived on tradition and honor, was not immune to evolution. By the mid-20th century, the insatiable demand for narcotics in the United States had transformed organized crimes. Calculus. The lure of heroin, the promise of immense wealth and influence, was impossible to ignore. For Stefano Magaddino and the Buffalo crime family, the narcotics pipeline was a shadowed realm where opportunity met peril, profit courted risk, and the consequences would resonate for decades. Long before the world understood the scale of the drug epidemic, the Mafia had begun to cultivate vast networks for smuggling heroin into North America. Montreal emerged as a critical node in this transnational supply chain, a gateway where shipments from Europe and the Caribbean converged. Before making their perilous journey southward, Magaddino's influence stretched seamlessly across this corridor, from the docks of Montreal to the streets of Buffalo, and beyond to Cuba, a nexus for narcotics routes in the Caribbean. Allegations of Magaddino's involvement in the heroin trade began to surface in the 1950s and 1960s, though evidence was often circumstantial, shrouded in silence, and confounded by layers of intermediaries. The family's cross-border connections allowed narcotics shipments to evade detection, concealed within legitimate cargo crossing the Niagara frontier. Montreal's underworld, closely linked with the Italian-Canadian Papalia family, provided critical infrastructure, dock workers, transporters, and corrupt officials who ensured the smooth flow of contraband. The pipeline was complex, orchestrated with the precision of a military operation. Heroin arrived in bulk shipments, powder, concealed within crates of manufactured goods or hidden among shipments of textiles and machinery. From Montreal, the cargo moved discreetly into Buffalo, where trusted lieutenants oversaw distribution to street-level dealers and wholesale operations. The profits were staggering, and the risks immense that Magaddino's involvement was marked by a cautious pragmatism. Unlike some crime families that flaunted their narcotics operations, the Buffalo family maintained a strict code of discretion. Magaddino himself publicly opposed overt narcotics trafficking, mindful of the additional law enforcement scrutiny it invited. Yet, behind closed doors, his organization reaped the rewards of the trade, balancing profit with prudence. That Cuba's role in this network was crucial, especially before the revolution transformed the island's political landscape. The islands, ports became hubs for narcotics transshipment, taking advantage of corrupt officials and lax enforcement. The connections between Buffalo, Montreal, and Cuba allowed the family to tap into Caribbean and European sources, creating a steady supply line that sustained their narcotics enterprise. As the heroin trade expanded, so too did federal attention. The FBI, DEA, and other agencies intensified investigations into narcotics trafficking, targeting the Mafia's key figures. Surveillance increased, informants emerged, and the government began to unravel the complex web of connections. Magaddino, once insulated by his discretion and political influence, found himself in the crosshairs of a growing manhunt. Despite the pressure, the Buffalo crime family's operations were remarkably resilient. Their layered command structure and tight internal discipline made infiltration difficult. Law enforcement's challenges were compounded by the family's control over labor unions and political contacts, which often tipped them off to impending raids or investigations. However, the narcotics pipeline was not without consequences. The trade brought increased violence, territorial disputes, betrayal, and enforcement actions escalated. The social fabric of communities in Buffalo and beyond began to fray, as addiction ravaged neighborhoods and fueled cycles of crime. The family's clandestine operations exacted a heavy toll on the very people whose labor and loyalty sustained their empire. Magaddino's death in 1974 marked a turning point. As the family's leadership transitioned, new figures emerged, some more willing to embrace narcotics trafficking openly, others more cautious. The federal government, empowered by new legislation and resources, launched sweeping indictments that targeted the narcotics pipeline, leading to convictions and the gradual dismantling of long-standing networks. Yet, the legacy of the narcotics trade endured. It left an indelible mark on the Buffalo crime family's history, an era where ambition and avarice intersected with tragedy and loss. The pipeline that once brought fortune also invited ruin, exposing the fragile balance between power and vulnerability that defined the Mafia's American saga. In this chapter of Shadows and Secrets, the narcotics pipeline reveals both the reach of organized crime and the price exacted by a society addicted to a deadly trade. It is a story of greed and discretion, of networks woven across borders, and of a family's attempt to navigate a perilous path through the dark currents of history. Chapter 12. The Shadow of Loyalty. Joe DiCarlo's Rise. In the quiet corners of Buffalo's underworld, a new figure was beginning to cast a long shadow. Joe DiCarlo. Cousin to the Magaddino clan, he was more than just family. To some, he was a trusted ally, a loyal lieutenant whose ambitions seemed aligned with the family's legacy. To others, he was a rival in disguise, a man whose ascent hinted at fractures within the seemingly unbreakable facade of the Buffalo crime family. His rise would mark a turning point, exposing the complex web of loyalty, power, and suspicion that defines the Mafia's inner workings. Joe DiCarlo was a man who understood the delicate balance between reverence and ruthlessness. Born into the extended Magaddino family, his early years were steeped in the traditions and expectations that came with belonging to one of the most powerful mafia dynasties in North America. Yet, unlike Stefano Magaddino's calm and measured approach, DeCarlo's style was more assertive, marked by a desire not only to preserve the family's empire, but to expand it, to make his own mark on a world dominated for decades by his aging cousin. His rise was gradual, almost imperceptible to outsiders. Trusted positions within the family's operations, labor rackets, gambling dens, and narcotics trafficking were entrusted to him. With each success, his influence grew, drawing both admiration and wariness. Allies praised his sharp mind and decisive actions. Adversaries whispered of his ambition, wary of the threat he posed to the established order. What made DeCarlo's ascent particularly complex was his blood relation to the Magaddino dynasty. Family ties in the Mafia are sacred, binding men through shared history and a code of loyalty that transcends the ordinary. But blood also complicates. The closer the bond, the more dangerous the rivalry. DeCarlo's proximity to Stefano was both a blessing and a curse. While it granted him entry and protection, it also placed him under scrutiny. Every move was analyzed. Every ambition weighed against the family's collective interests. As the 1960s turned into the 1970s, internal friction within the Buffalo crime family began to surface more openly. The old guard, loyal to Stefano's steady hand, viewed DeCarlo's growing influence with suspicion. They questioned whether his aggressive approach endangered the fragile peace that had preserved the family for decades. Meanwhile, younger members saw in DeCarlo a potential leader who could revitalize the family, ready to adapt to the changing landscape of organized crime. The tension was subtle but palpable, a quiet war waged through meetings behind closed doors, veiled conversations, and strategic alliances. DeCarlo was known to cultivate supporters among capos and soldiers, promising them shares of new ventures and protection in turbulent times. His ability to navigate this political landscape demonstrated a keen understanding of power's nuances, a blend of patronage, intimidation, and persuasion. Yet, this rise was not without cost. The old loyalties that once united the family frayed as lines were drawn between factions. Some saw DeCarlo as a potential successor to Stefano, threatening the established hierarchy. Others feared he might destabilize the family's operations, provoking law enforcement or rival families. Rumors circulated of secret meetings, backroom deals, and whispered betrayals. Hallmarks of a family at a crossroads, DeCarlo's own motivations remain a subject of speculation. Was he a loyal steward of the family's legacy, determined to protect it at all costs? Or was he an ambitious opportunist, willing to sacrifice tradition for personal gain? The truth likely lies somewhere in between, a man shaped by loyalty, but driven by the hunger for power that defines the Mafia's brutal realities. Throughout this period, DeCarlo maintained a public persona of quiet confidence and respect for Stefano's authority. Yet, beneath this surface, he was laying the groundwork for a future in which he might claim the throne. His network extended beyond Buffalo's borders, forging connections with allied families in New York, Chicago, and Canada. These relationships expanded his reach, offering opportunities that the aging Magaddino might have overlooked or dismissed. The growing internal friction reached a critical point as law enforcement intensified its scrutiny of the Buffalo crime family. Investigations, wiretaps, and informants began to expose cracks within the organization. In this atmosphere of heightened pressure, trust became scarce and suspicion flourished. DeCarlo's rivals within the family sought to undermine him, portraying him as reckless and disloyal. Conversely, his supporters argued that his leadership was essential for survival in a rapidly changing criminal landscape. This internal struggle was more than a simple power play. It reflected the evolving nature of organized crime itself. The Mafia was no longer the monolithic force of old. It was fragmented, challenged by law enforcement, rival gangs, and shifting social dynamics. Leaders like DeCarlo represented a new generation, grappling with the legacy they inherited and the uncertain future ahead. The shadow of loyalty that once protected the family now cast doubt and division. Joe DiCarlo's rise was emblematic of this tension, a story of ambition entwined with obligation, of power sought within the bonds of blood, and of a family struggling to adapt without losing its soul. In the end, his ascent would prove both a catalyst for change and a harbinger of the challenges that lay ahead for the Buffalo crime family. As the chapter closes, the viewer is left with a haunting question. In a world ruled by silence and secrecy, where does loyalty end and betrayal begin? Joe DiCarlo's story offers no easy answers, only the stark reality of a criminal empire caught between its past and its future, held together by fragile ties and threatened by the ambitions that shadow every man's rise. Chapter 13. Wiretaps and Vaults. The FBI closes in. By the late 1960s, the unyielding shadow of law enforcement had begun to fall heavily across the once impenetrable fortress of the Buffalo crime family. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, armed with new technology and an insatiable determination, turned its gaze steadily towards Stefano Magaddino's empire, a sprawling network that had operated with near impunity for decades. The family's carefully cultivated veil of silence, secrecy, and subtlety was now facing an unprecedented assault, one that would test the limits of its discipline and resilience. Surveillance had always been a key tool in the government's arsenal against organized crime, but the late 1960s marked a turning point. Advances in wiretapping technology and legal shifts allowed the FBI to infiltrate conversations once believed untouchable. For the Buffalo crime family, whose operations depended on discretion and coded communication, this intrusion was both a revelation and a nightmare. The familiar rhythm of meetings, negotiations, and clandestine dealings was suddenly recorded, transcribed, and analyzed with ruthless precision. The initial wiretaps began as discreet efforts to gather intelligence, bugging key phones, intercepting messages, and placing agents near family strongholds. Agents monitored the funeral home on 9th Street, a central hub for Magaddino's operations, and other strategic locations. For years, these efforts yielded little public evidence, but behind the scenes, they provided invaluable insight into the family's inner workings, the names, the hierarchies, the plans. One of the most significant breakthroughs came in 1968, during a raid that would become infamous in Mafia history. Federal agents, armed with warrants and backed by months of surveillance, descended upon a seemingly ordinary warehouse in Buffalo's industrial district. Hidden behind its unassuming walls was a vault, a steel enclosure whose contents promised to reveal the secrets long whispered about but never confirmed. The raid was meticulously planned. Agents worked in silence under the cloak of night, aware that any mistake could tip off the family or result in lost evidence. Inside the vault, they uncovered a trove of cash, meticulously stacked in bundles, enough to fund the family's operations for years. But the money was only part of the story. Alongside it were ledgers, coded messages, and other documents that laid bare the financial machinations of the organization. The codes baffled some investigators initially, a jumble of symbols, numbers, and references that seemed indecipherable. Yet, through painstaking work and the assistance of informants, the FBI began to unravel the meaning, tracking payments, identifying rackets, and linking individuals across the criminal network. This discovery transformed the investigation, providing a roadmap to the Mafia's empire. The psychological impact of the raid on the Buffalo crime family was profound. For decades, the family had operated under the assumption that their secrets were safe, that their systems of communication and trust were impenetrable. Now, that illusion was shattered. The realization that their conversations were no longer private, that their vaults could be breached, sent ripples of fear and paranoia. Through the ranks, Magaddino, ever the composed leader, faced this new reality with a mixture of defiance and caution. His response was to tighten internal discipline further, restricting meetings, changing communication methods, and scrutinizing associates with renewed suspicion. The code of silence became more stringent, but cracks had already begun to appear within. The family mistrust grew. Members feared betrayal, not only from rivals and informants, but from within. The FBI's ability to monitor conversations sowed seeds of doubt, fracturing bonds that had once been unbreakable. Loyalty, the Mafia's most prized virtue, became fragile in the face of the growing storm. The 1968 vault raid also galvanized law enforcement. The physical evidence gathered allowed prosecutors to bring more substantial charges, targeting key figures within the organization. Trials followed, marked by testimony from insiders who, pressured by legal consequences or personal grievances, broke the silence. These trials exposed the family's operations to the public, eroding its mystique and power. Yet, despite these setbacks, the Buffalo crime family did not collapse overnight. Its deep roots in the community, political connections, and ability to adapt enabled it to survive. The family shifted tactics, moving to more covert methods, dispersing operations, and reinforcing their networks in Canada and beyond. This chapter in the family's history reveals the relentless nature of law enforcement's campaign and the profound challenges it posed. It highlights the tension between tradition and change, between the Mafia's age-old codes and the modern world's intrusive technologies. For Stefano Magaddino and his successors, it marked a turning point, a slow, painful erosion of the empire built in shadows. The FBI's wiretaps and the 1968 vault raid stand as emblematic moments in this struggle, symbols of an unstoppable force pressing against a fortress that, for all its strength, was not invincible. The story is one of surveillance, secrets, and the fragile line between power and downfall, a story that shaped the fate of the Buffalo crime family and the landscape of American organized crime. Chapter 14. Blood Betrayals. Magaddino's own turn on him. The world of organized crime is ruled by codes of loyalty, honor, and silence. Yet, beneath these sacred oaths lies a fragile web of trust, vulnerable to the corrosive forces of ambition, fear, and betrayal. For Stefano Magaddino, the patriarch of the Buffalo crime family, no betrayal cut deeper than the one that came from within his own bloodline. His son Peter and his cousin Joe DiCarlo. This fracture would cast a long shadow over the family's empire and plunge Magaddino into a solitude marked by paranoia and isolation. For decades, Stefano Magaddino had built his empire with a relentless grip, an empire sustained not only by ruthless enforcement but by a familial loyalty that few dared to challenge. His son Peter, raised in the shadow of power and expectation, was groomed to inherit the mantle. Joe DiCarlo, his cousin and trusted lieutenant, had risen steadily, navigating the treacherous currents of mafia politics with ambition and subtlety. Together, they represented the future of the Buffalo crime family, a legacy of blood and power. But as the years unfolded, cracks began to appear beneath this surface of unity. Peter Magaddino, once loyal and deferential, grew restless and frustrated. The old ways, the slow, cautious methods of his father, seemed increasingly out of step with the changing times. Peter harbored ambitions of his own, visions of a more aggressive, expansive family, willing to embrace new ventures and confront rivals with force. This ambition set him on a collision course with his father's cautious conservatism. Meanwhile, Joe DiCarlo's ascent added another layer of complexity. His growing influence, combined with his blood relation to Stefano, made him a figure both indispensable and threatening. DiCarlo's willingness to challenge the status quo and pursue his own vision of power unsettled the established order. He cultivated alliances within the family, positioning himself as a potential successor or even a rival to the aging boss. The tension between these three men unfolded in whispers, coded conversations, and subtle maneuvers. To the outside world, the family maintained its facade of cohesion and strength. But inside, suspicion festered. Peter and Joe began to question Stefano's leadership, his decisions, his alliances, his cautious stance on narcotics and expansion. They perceived his approach as outdated, risking the family's survival in a world growing more hostile and complex. This internal dissent was not merely ideological. It became personal and dangerous. Peter and Joe sought greater control, moving to sideline or undermine Stefano's authority. In the Mafia's unforgiving world, such moves could be lethal. Betrayal was a currency often paid in blood. Stefano's response was a descent into isolation. The man once known for his quiet strength and commanding presence became increasingly paranoid, wary of even those closest to him. Meetings grew infrequent. Decisions were delegated to trusted confidants. The family's inner circle fractured, along fault lines of loyalty and ambition. Magaddino, once the unchallenged patriarch, found himself increasingly alone. His paranoia was not unfounded. Law enforcement pressure intensified, and the family's cohesion weakened. The trust that had bound generations was unraveling. Reports circulated of secret meetings, whispered plots, and shifting alliances. The very foundations of the family, its codes of loyalty and silence, were breaking down. Peter and Joe's turn against Stefano was not a simple coup, but a complex power struggle steeped in personal grievances, generational conflict, and survival instinct. They saw their actions as necessary, a brutal recalibration to preserve the family's future in a world that demanded adaptation and ruthlessness. For Stefano, the betrayal was a devastating blow. Beyond the strategic and operational damage, it was a wound to his identity. The patriarch betrayed by his own blood, the family fractured at its core. His health declined, his influence waned. The man who had once ruled with a blend of iron and discretion became a shadow of himself, haunted by the ghosts of trust broken and alliances lost. The consequences of this blood betrayal rippled through the Buffalo crime family. Internal conflicts erupted into violence, weakening the family's grip on territory and operations. Rival factions vied for control, exploiting the uncertainty and distrust. The family's enemies sensed vulnerability, pressing their advantage. At the same time, law enforcement capitalized on the chaos. Informants emerged from the fractures, testimony was secured, and indictments followed. The family's once impenetrable shield of silence was pierced from within, exposing secrets long guarded in darkness. Yet, amidst the turmoil, the legacy of Stefano Magaddino endured, a testament to a life spent navigating the treacherous currents of power, loyalty, and betrayal. His story is a poignant reminder that in the Mafia's world, the greatest threats often come not from rivals or the law, but from within the fragile bonds of blood and family. As this chapter closes, the viewer is left with a stark truth. Power is as fragile as it is intoxicating. Betrayal can come from the closest kin, and in the end, even the strongest empires can crumble under the weight of their own blood. Chapter 15. Canadian Bloodshed, the Musitano and Papalia Conflicts. In the shadowed borderlands between the United States and Canada, a fragile alliance began to unravel with deadly consequences. For decades, the Buffalo crime family had maintained a powerful and often unseen presence across the Niagara River, forging uneasy partnerships with Canadian families like the Papalias in Hamilton and the Musitanos in Ontario. These alliances were built on mutual benefit, a shared interest in controlling gambling, narcotics, labor unions, and the flow of illicit goods across the border. But as the 1970s gave way to the 1980s, cracks appeared in this transnational empire, revealing a landscape marked by simmering tensions and violent clashes that would engulf Ontario in a wave of bloodshed. The Musitano family, originally of Calabrian descent, had long operated in the shadows of Hamilton's criminal underworld. Allied with the Papalias, who were themselves powerful players with deep roots in the Canadian Mafia, the Musitanos had become key enforcers and partners in the cross-border operations tied to Buffalo's influence. Yet, beneath the surface of cooperation lay rivalries for control over territory and lucrative rackets. The delicate balance of power was sustained by an unspoken understanding, but like all such alliances forged in the crucible of crime, it was vulnerable to greed, betrayal, and shifting ambitions. Violence first erupted quietly, small acts of intimidation, messages sent through brutality, a growing sense of mistrust. These were not random acts of chaos, but calculated moves, each a statement of power and a test of resolve. The streets of Hamilton and surrounding Ontario towns grew tense, with local law enforcement struggling to keep pace with the rising tide of organized crime's darker undercurrents. The Canadian wing of the Buffalo crime family, once a symbol of unity and strength, was beginning to spiral out of control. The Papalia family, led by the formidable Johnny Pops Papalia, was a pillar of authority in the region. Known for his imposing presence and ruthless efficiency, Papalia had long managed to keep internal disputes in check and rivalries at bay. But as the Musitanos sought to expand their influence, open conflict became unavoidable. The contest for dominance escalated rapidly, with violent retribution marking each new move point. One of the defining moments came with a series of brazen assassinations. Shots fired in the dead of night echoed through the industrial districts, targets gunned down with ruthless precision. These killings were not just acts of vengeance, but strategic attempts to dismantle rival power bases. Each loss sent shockwaves through the families, destabilizing alliances and igniting cycles of retaliation. The local communities bore the brunt of this violence. Innocent bystanders were caught in the crossfire. Neighborhoods once vibrant with everyday life became places marked by fear and suspicion. The police forces, often ill-equipped and overwhelmed, faced an uphill battle against an enemy that blended seamlessly into the social fabric. Witness intimidation and the Mafia's code of silence rendered investigations difficult, frustrating efforts to restore order as the bloodshed continued. The federal governments of Canada and the United States grew increasingly concerned. Cross-border cooperation between law enforcement agencies intensified, leading to coordinated raids, arrests, and prosecutions. Yet, the criminal networks proved adaptable, shifting operations, exploiting legal loopholes, and leveraging political connections to evade complete dismantlement. Within this maelstrom, the Buffalo crime family's authority over its Canadian affiliates waned. The once tightly controlled alliances fractured, and the family's ability to enforce discipline diminished. Internal dissent, coupled with external pressures, created a volatile environment where loyalty was uncertain and violence the currency of power. The Musitano-Papalia conflict exemplified the perils of criminal empires stretched across national boundaries. Cultural differences, competing ambitions, and the challenges of remote oversight contributed to an environment ripe for conflict. The very alliances that had once strengthened the family became sources of vulnerability and strife. This period of Canadian bloodshed not only reshaped the underworld landscape, but also marked a turning point in the Buffalo crime family's decline. The violence exposed fissures that could no longer be ignored, eroding the family's prestige and inviting intensified law enforcement focus. The legacy of these conflicts would reverberate for decades, influencing the trajectory of organized crime in both Canada and the United States. In the final reckoning, the Musitano and Papalia conflicts serve as a grim reminder that even the most powerful criminal dynasties are fragile, susceptible to the forces of ambition, betrayal, and the inexorable violence that often accompanies a life built on crime. This chapter in the Buffalo crime family's history is not only a tale of blood and power, but a human story of communities caught in the crossfire of an empire unraveling. Chapter 16. A Kingdom Cracks. The Fall of DeCarlo. Joe DeCarlo's rise within the Buffalo crime family had once seemed unstoppable, a meteoric ascent marked by sharp ambition and calculated moves. Born into the extended Magaddino bloodline, DeCarlo was more than just family. He was a figure who embodied the shifting dynamics of a criminal empire wrestling with change. Yet, as swiftly as he climbed, his kingdom began to crack, unraveling under pressure, betrayal, and the unforgiving demands of a world ruled by silence and violence. The 1970s were turbulent years for the Buffalo crime family. The aging reign of Stefano Magaddino was giving way to new, uncertain leadership. The family was beset by external pressures, law enforcement raids, shifting alliances, and the growing chaos in their Canadian affiliates. Internally, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Joe DiCarlo found himself at the epicenter of this storm, navigating a treacherous path between loyalty to an empire and his own hunger for power. Initially, DiCarlo had been a loyal lieutenant, trusted to oversee key operations and manage the family's most lucrative rackets. His influence stretched across labor unions, gambling dens, and narcotics routes, making him a formidable figure both feared and respected. But with power came enemies, some loyal to the old guard, others eyeing his ascent with envy and distrust. The Mafia's internal politics were brutal, and alliances were as fragile as they were vital. The cracks in DiCarlo's kingdom began with whispers, rumors of disloyalty, of secret deals made without the blessing of the family's elders. These rumors, whether grounded in fact or fueled by jealousy, were deadly in their consequences. In a world where trust was currency and betrayal spelled death, mere suspicion could trigger fatal outcomes. Law enforcement pressure compounded these. Internal threats. The FBI's wiretaps and investigations increasingly targeted DiCarlo, scrutinizing his movements and communications. The mounting evidence, combined with informants emerging from within the family's ranks, made his position perilous. Facing indictments and potential imprisonment, DiCarlo's options dwindled. Betrayal came from within. Trusted allies, seeking to protect themselves or curry favor with rivals, turned their backs. Meetings meant to solidify unity instead became traps. DiCarlo realized the family he had helped build was fracturing, and he was becoming a liability. The culmination of this internal strife forced DiCarlo to make a fateful decision: flight. In a clandestine operation cloaked in urgency, he vanished from Buffalo's streets, fleeing into exile. His departure was both a survival tactic and a tacit admission that his kingdom had crumbled. Exile, however, was no refuge. Away from his power base, DiCarlo became vulnerable, cut off from resources, allies, and influence. He existed in the shadows of a world that had once been his domain, a fallen prince navigating the consequences of ambition and betrayal. Back in Buffalo, DiCarlo's fall sent shockwaves through the crime family. His absence created a power vacuum, igniting fresh struggles for control among remaining factions. The old alliances weakened further, and the family's cohesion frayed under the combined weight of law enforcement pressure and internal discord for the community and the underworld alike. DiCarlo's downfall was a stark indicator that the Buffalo crime family was no longer the unassailable force it once was. The empire Stefano Magaddino had painstakingly built was showing signs of decay. A kingdom cracking at its core, DiCarlo's story is a portrait of the Mafia's brutal realities, the fleeting nature of power, the dangers of ambition, and the inevitable betrayals that come with a life lived in the shadows. His rise and fall are emblematic of a family struggling to hold on to its legacy amid changing times and relentless pressure. As this chapter closes, the viewer is left with a haunting image: a man who once commanded fear and respect, now a fugitive, a symbol of an empire's fragile grip on power. The fall of Joe DiCarlo marks not just the end of a reign, but the unraveling of a dynasty, a kingdom whose cracks would widen until only memories remained of its former might. Chapter 17. The Death of the Old Don. The summer of 1974 marked the end of an era. Stefano Magaddino, the Old Don, the Quiet Don, the patriarch who had ruled the Buffalo crime family with an iron fist and a shrewd mind for nearly half a century, breathed his last. His death was not just the passing of a man, but the symbolic collapse of a golden era, a final closing of a chapter that had defined organized crime in Buffalo and beyond for decades. That Magaddino's reign was legendary. Arriving in America from the Sicilian coast at the dawn of the 20th century, he had carved out a vast empire from the chaotic, often violent underworld of Buffalo. His influence stretched across borders, from the docks of Niagara Falls to the gambling dens of Ontario, and deep into the political fabric of Western New York. The Don was a man of paradoxes, reserved yet ruthless, cautious yet commanding, a quiet force whose power was felt rather than flaunted. His death was, in many ways, as unassuming as the man himself. It came after years of declining health, a slow dimming of the light that had once burned so fiercely. In his final days, Magaddino was a shadow of the formidable figure he had been, a man weighed down by time and the mounting pressures that had eroded his once unchallengeable authority. His passing was met with solemn respect, both within the family and across the criminal underworld, a tacit acknowledgement that an epoch had ended. The Buffalo crime family, built on his vision and iron discipline, now faced an uncertain future. The old Don's absence left a void that no single figure could easily fill. His style of leadership, rooted in patience, secrecy, and a deep understanding of the delicate balance of power, was not easily replicated. Those who aspired to succeed him were met with challenges both from within and without. Factional rivalries, law enforcement crackdowns, and the shifting tides of organized crime across North America. Magaddino's death also exposed the vulnerabilities that had long simmered beneath the surface of the family's facade. Internal divisions, once held in check by his authority, began to erupt more openly. Ambitions clashed, alliances fractured, and the cohesion that had kept the family strong began to unravel. The golden era, defined by relative stability and control, gave way to a period of uncertainty and decline. Beyond the internal struggles, the death of the old Don symbolized a broader shift in the American Mafia. The old ways, the codes, the respect, the regional empires were being challenged by new forces, younger, more aggressive leaders, law enforcement agencies armed with unprecedented tools, and the relentless march of time. Buffalo's crime family, once among the most powerful, was no longer at the center of the underworld spotlight. For the communities touched by the family's reach, Magaddino's passing brought a mixture of relief and apprehension. Some viewed the end of his reign as the close of a dark chapter, a chance for renewal and lawfulness. Others feared the chaos that often follows the fall of a powerful figure, violence, instability, and the rise of unpredictable elements to Magaddino's funeral was a somber affair, attended by a mix of mourners, family, loyal associates, and figures from the broader Mafia network. The ceremonies were marked by tradition and respect, a final tribute to a man whose life had been inseparable from the shadows he inhabited. Yet, amid the eulogies and farewells, there was an unspoken understanding. This was the end of a dynasty. The legacy left behind was complex. Stefano Magaddino was remembered as a master strategist, a man who had built an empire from immigrants and outcasts, wielding influence that spanned 2 countries. But he was also a figure whose reign was defined by violence, fear, and the exploitation of communities. His death forced a reckoning with both the power and the cost of his empire. In the years that followed, the Buffalo crime family would never regain the stature it held under Magaddino's command. New leaders struggled to maintain control, while law enforcement pressure intensified. The golden era faded into memory, replaced by a more fractured and vulnerable organization. Yet, the story of Stefano Magaddino, the old Don who ruled quietly but decisively, remains etched into the history of organized crime. His death in 1974 stands as a poignant marker, the closing note of a symphony played over decades of ambition, loyalty, and survival. It reminds us that even the mightiest empires, no matter how carefully built, are subject to the inexorable passage of time. As the chapter ends, the viewer is left with a lingering sense of loss and transformation, the death of a man who was both a symbol and architect of an era, and the uncertain dawn that follows the fall of a legend. Chapter 18. Frangiamore's Fragile Rule. In the aftermath of Stefano Magaddino's death, the once formidable Buffalo crime family faced an uncertain future. The empire that had been forged through decades of calculated power and quiet domination now stood exposed, fractured by internal rivalries, battered by relentless law enforcement pressure, and challenged by a rapidly changing criminal landscape. Into this volatile environment stepped Samuel Frangiamore, a man whose rise to leadership would become a testament to the fragile hold of tradition amid the unyielding tides of change. Samuel "Sammy" Frangiamore was no stranger to the inner workings of the family. A loyal soldier and trusted capo, he had long operated in the shadows of the Magaddino reign, executing orders with the blend of discretion and force that the family demanded. Yet, Frangiamore was not a figure accustomed to wielding unchallenged authority. When the mantle of leadership fell to him, it was not with the grandeur of a rightful heir or the assured confidence of a seasoned kingpin, but rather with the cautious steps of a man trying to hold together a crumbling empire. The challenges he faced were immense. Internally, the family was riven with mistrust. The vacuum left by Magaddino's death had invited opportunists and ambitious factions to jostle for position. The delicate balance of power, once maintained by the old Don's iron discipline and strategic patience, was now unraveling. Frangiamore sought to restore order, relying on the old-school methods that had once proven effective: strict codes of conduct, enforced silence, and a ruthless approach to any dissent. But times had changed. The law enforcement apparatus was stronger, smarter, and more determined than ever before. The FBI and Canadian authorities had honed their surveillance tactics, leveraging wiretaps, informants, and federal racketeering statutes to dismantle organized crime from within. The once impenetrable veil of secrecy was lifting, exposing cracks and vulnerabilities that Frangiamore struggled to conceal. Despite his best efforts, Frangiamore's leadership was marked by a persistent fragility. His attempts to unite the family often faltered amid growing internal resentments. Younger, more aggressive figures challenged his authority, eager to exploit new criminal enterprises and unwilling to abide by the cautious traditions he espoused. The era of slow, deliberate consolidation was giving way to rapid, violent turf wars, and Frangiamore's measured style struggled to command respect in this new milieu. Moreover, the family's influence in key sectors, labor unions, gambling operations, narcotics trafficking, was eroding. Rivals and outside criminal groups encroached on territory once firmly held. The border empire that had been a cornerstone of Magaddino's power was weakening under increased scrutiny and competition. Frangiamore faced not only internal dissent, but an expanding field of adversaries. Yet, within this chaos, Frangiamore maintained a resolute commitment to the old Mafia code. Loyalty was his cornerstone, and he demanded it fiercely. He surrounded himself with trusted allies, men whose own fates were bound tightly to the family's survival. Discipline was enforced through intimidation and, when necessary, violence. Informants and suspected traitors were dealt with swiftly, sending a clear message that betrayal would not be tolerated. Still, the pressure was unrelenting. The family's meetings became more secretive, operations more covert. The risk of arrests and convictions loomed large over every move. High-profile trials and defections had already decimated ranks. Frangiamore had to navigate not just the external forces of law enforcement, but the internal dangers of paranoia and suspicion that threatened to undo the family from within. Frangiamore's rule was also marked by a deep awareness of the family's legacy. He understood that the empire he now led was built on foundations both magnificent and fragile, a product of decades of bloodshed, negotiation, and survival. The lessons of the past shaped his approach, a cautious pragmatism that sought to preserve what remained rather than expand recklessly. However, pragmatism was often no match for ambition and the shifting dynamics of organized crime. Younger generations viewed the old codes as shackles, resisting the restraint that had governed previous decades. New criminal enterprises, from drug trafficking to loan sharking, demanded a different kind of leadership, more aggressive, less patient. Frangiamore's attempts to steer the family back to its former stability increasingly felt like trying to hold back a tide already in retreat. The fragile nature of his leadership was reflected in the family's operations. The intricate networks of control over labor unions and gambling rings showed signs of strain. Corruption, once carefully managed, became more visible. The family's political connections weakened as officials distanced themselves, wary of association amid growing public scrutiny that on a personal level, Frangiamore bore the weight of leadership with a somber dignity. He was a man shaped by the shadows, a figure who understood the costs of the criminal life, not just in money and power, but in lives lost, trust broken, and the relentless march of time. His was a stewardship born not of grand ambition, but of necessity. A reluctant guardian of a fading dynasty, as law enforcement tightened the noose, Frangiamore found himself increasingly isolated. The family's once vast empire was shrinking, its once solid alliances fracturing. The old loyalty that had been the family's backbone was fragile and frayed, vulnerable to betrayal and collapse that in the end, Samuel Frangiamore's rule stands as a poignant chapter in the Buffalo crime family's history, a story of a man trying to hold together a legacy slipping through his fingers. It is a tale of resilience in the face of decline, of tradition battling against change, and of power's inevitable impermanence. The Buffalo crime family, under Frangiamore, was no longer the monolith it had been under Magaddino. It was a shadow of itself, still dangerous, still capable, but vulnerable, fragile. And in that fragility lay the truth of an empire that had reached the twilight of its glory. As this chapter closes, the viewer is left with the haunting sense of a fading dynasty, a family caught between its storied past and an uncertain future, held together by a fragile thread of loyalty, discipline, and the lingering ghosts of a time long gone. Chapter 19. Rise of the Taduros, a new mafia order. The waning years of the 20th century marked a profound transformation within the Buffalo crime family, a shift from the old guard's iron-fisted rule toward a more modern, calculated, and business-oriented approach. At the heart of this evolution stood Joseph Tadaro Sr., and alongside him, his son, Joseph Tadaro Jr., poised to carry forward a legacy reimagined for a new era. Their ascent signaled not merely a change in leadership, but the birth of a new mafia order, one that sought power through discretion, legitimate business facades, and a quiet command of influence. Joseph Tadaro Sr., known simply as Papa Joe within the family and the streets of Buffalo, was a figure shaped by the realities of a changing criminal landscape. Unlike the flamboyant or overtly violent dons of earlier decades, Tadaro was the embodiment of subtlety and prudence. His rise reflected a strategic pivot away from the violent turf wars and high-profile power struggles that had so often defined the family's history. Instead, Tadaro emphasized stability, infiltration into legitimate enterprises, and an unwavering focus on protecting the family's interests beneath the surface of public view. The foundation of Tadaro's influence was his deep involvement in the construction and waste management industries, sectors long entwined with organized crime but offering ample cover for money laundering, racketeering, and influence peddling. Through these ventures, Tadaro crafted an intricate web of economic control that extended beyond Buffalo's borders, intertwining with local unions, politicians, and businesses. This network became a formidable source of power, wealth, and protection, a modern-day empire camouflaged within the fabric of legitimate commerce. His son, Joseph Tadaro Jr., was a pivotal partner in this endeavor. Groomed from an early age to navigate both the criminal and business worlds, Jr. brought a fresh perspective to the family's operations. Where his father favored caution and patience, the younger Tadaro combined traditional mafia loyalty with a sharper understanding of corporate structures, legal loopholes, and media optics. This generational blend forged a leadership that was both rooted in heritage and adaptive to contemporary challenges. The Tadaro's approach was marked by an almost invisible presence. They shunned the overt displays of power that had previously drawn unwanted attention. Gone were the large public gatherings, the flashy vehicles, and the conspicuous acts of violence. In their place was a deliberate strategy of low-profile dominance, where control was asserted through influence rather than intimidation, and conflicts were resolved through negotiation or discreet enforcement. This business-first approach extended beyond mere facade. The Tadaros invested in legitimate enterprises, weaving their operations into the economic lifeblood of Western New York. They cultivated relationships with city officials, labor leaders, and business owners, blurring the lines between legality and criminality. Such integration made them both indispensable and elusive, difficult to prosecute, easy to overlook, and deeply embedded in the region's power structures. Yet, beneath this veneer of legitimacy, the Buffalo crime family retained its core criminal functions. The Tadaros managed narcotics trafficking, loan sharking, gambling, and extortion with a level of professionalism that reflected their evolving priorities. Violence was employed sparingly, reserved for necessity rather than spectacle, ensuring that law enforcement's gaze remained diverted. This balance of business acumen and traditional muscle became the hallmark of their reign. The Tadaros also embraced a modern understanding of media and public perception. Recognizing the dangers of association with organized crime, they meticulously crafted their public personas. Joe Sr., often described as affable and community-oriented, participated in charitable events and maintained a public image far removed from that of a mob boss. This duality, a man of the people and a shadowy kingpin, was a deliberate shield against scrutiny. Despite these efforts, law enforcement agencies did not turn a blind eye. The Tadaros were repeatedly implicated in investigations, their names surfacing in federal indictments and surveillance reports. However, their careful operations, layered through legitimate businesses and guarded by tight-knit loyalty, often thwarted prosecution efforts. This cat-and-mouse dynamic defined much of the Buffalo crime family's later decades, an ongoing battle of wits, patience, and adaptation. The family's transition under the Tadaros reflected broader changes within organized crime nationally. The Mafia was no longer the lawless, overtly violent force it once had been. Instead, it evolved into a clandestine entity, one that blended with legitimate society, wielding power through influence, corruption, and economic manipulation. The Tadaros' leadership embodied this transformation, guiding Buffalo's Mafia into a modern age while preserving the traditions that had sustained it. Yet, the rise of the Tadaros was not without challenges. The family faced competition from emerging criminal groups, street gangs, motorcycle clubs, and international cartels that operated with different codes and more brutal tactics. Internal disputes occasionally flared, and the pressure from ever-watchful federal agencies intensified. The balance the Tadaros sought to maintain was delicate, requiring constant vigilance and adaptability. Still, their tenure represented a pragmatic evolution, a recognition that survival in the latter half of the 20th century required more than muscle. It demanded a nuanced blend of power, subtlety, and integration. Through Joseph Tadaro Sr. and Jr., the Buffalo crime family secured a new kind of strength, quiet, enduring, and deeply enmeshed in the economic and social fabric of their domain. As this chapter closes, the viewer is invited to reflect on the profound transformation of a criminal empire, one that mirrors the complexities of power itself. The Tadaros' rise is a study in adaptation, resilience, and the quiet assertion of control, a testament to a mafia order reinvented for the modern age, where shadows move unseen and influence speaks louder than guns. Chapter 20, Silent but Alive. The 80s and 90s. The decades of the 1980s and 1990s marked a profound shift in the identity of the Buffalo crime family. Gone were the days of public displays of violence and theatrical power struggles that had once punctuated the family's history. Instead, the organization adopted a quieter, more calculated approach, one defined not by gunfire echoing in city streets, but by the subtle, often unseen manipulation of economic and social systems. This was a family still very much alive, yet operating under a veil of discretion that masked its enduring influence and adaptability. The transition to this subdued existence was not simply a strategic choice. It was a necessity born of relentless law enforcement pressure and a changing criminal landscape. Federal authorities, armed with new investigative tools, RICO statutes, wiretaps, undercover operations, had transformed the war against organized crime. High-profile convictions across the nation sent ripples through mafia families, Buffalo included. The cost of overt violence and blatant corruption had become too great, and survival demanded a shift in tactics. The Buffalo crime family responded by deepening its entrenchment within legitimate industries: real estate, labor unions, waste management, and construction. These sectors, inherently complex and rife with opportunities for exploitation, became the family's new battleground. Control over labor unions in particular offered a potent means to influence markets and exert pressure, all under the guise of legality. Through these channels, the family wielded power quietly but effectively, extracting wealth and influence while minimizing public exposure. Real estate emerged as a crucial frontier. The family invested heavily in property holdings, development projects, and leasing arrangements, often serving as silent partners or facilitators for schemes that laundered illicit proceeds into clean assets. These ventures provided not only financial gain, but also a shield against scrutiny. Properties under family control became nodes in a sprawling network of influence, connecting legitimate business interests with underground activities. The family's involvement in labor unions, especially those connected to the construction trades and shipping industries, was a legacy inherited from previous generations but adapted to contemporary realities. By controlling union leadership or exerting influence over key officials, the family could dictate contract awards, inflate project costs, and ensure a steady flow of cash through kickbacks and extortion. These operations were often cloaked in layers of intermediaries and legal fronts, complicating investigations and prosecutions. This era was also characterized by a noticeable decline in public violence. The blood-soaked turf wars and assassination plots that had once made headlines gave way to more discreet methods of enforcement and discipline. Threats, intimidation, and carefully calibrated acts of violence replaced open gun battles. The family understood that visibility invited law enforcement attention and public backlash, luxuries they could no longer afford. Despite this quieter profile, the Buffalo crime family remained a formidable force in its region. Its members were adept at navigating the gray areas between legality and criminality, exploiting loopholes, and leveraging political connections. The family maintained a network of relationships with local officials, business leaders, and community figures, relationships often forged through subtle coercion, mutual benefit, or long-standing loyalty. The 80s and 90s also saw the family confronting new challenges. The rise of street gangs, drug cartels, and other organized crime groups introduced competition that was often more violent and unpredictable. These groups operated outside traditional mafia codes, embracing overt brutality and rapid expansion. While the Buffalo crime family avoided such recklessness, it faced ongoing pressure to defend its turf and interests. Internal dynamics within the family reflected these external pressures. The older generation, exemplified by figures like Joseph Tadaro Sr., sought to maintain order and continuity through cautious leadership. At the same time, younger members pushed for adaptation, new revenue streams, and occasionally more aggressive tactics. Balancing tradition with innovation became a constant struggle, one that shaped the family's trajectory through these decades. Law enforcement efforts intensified during this period. Federal investigations, wiretaps, and informants chipped away at the family's operations. Some members were indicted and convicted, yet the core structure proved resilient. The family's strategy of low visibility and integration into legitimate business insulated it from the total collapse experienced by some other mafia families across the country. The impact on the communities touched by the Buffalo crime family was complex. On one hand, the reduction in violent crime and public spectacle brought a measure of relief to neighborhoods once haunted by mafia warfare. On the other, the family's continued manipulation of unions, businesses, and politics perpetuated cycles of corruption, economic distortion, and fear. The mafia's influence was less overt but no less pervasive. Culturally, the Mafia's image evolved during this time. The romanticized notion of mobsters as colorful outlaws gave way to a more shadowy and inscrutable figure, an unseen force operating behind the scenes, shaping lives and fortunes without fanfare. The Buffalo crime family embodied this transformation, its story reflecting the broader evolution of organized crime in America. In sum, the 80s and 90s were decades of survival and adaptation for the Buffalo crime family. It was a time when power was exercised not through violence in the streets, but through control of economic and political systems, quietly, efficiently, and with deadly purpose. The family remained silent but alive, a testament to the enduring nature of organized crime when it learns to blend with the structures of legitimate society. As this chapter closes, the viewer is left to ponder the paradox of power cloaked in silence, the invisible hand that shapes communities, markets, and lives, often without notice or acknowledgement. The Buffalo crime family's journey through these decades is a story of resilience, transformation, and the subtle art of survival. In the Shadows, Chapter 21, FBI Takedowns Across the Border. The early years of the new millennium brought unprecedented challenges to the Buffalo crime family. Challenges not only from within the United States, but across the international border in Canada. For decades, the symbiotic relationship between the Buffalo Mafia and its Canadian counterparts, the Papaglia family in Hamilton and the Musitano family in Ontario, had ensured a robust and intertwined criminal empire. This alliance had allowed illicit enterprises to flourish across borders, with drug trafficking, gambling, extortion, and labor racketeering operating seamlessly between two nations. But the dawn of the 21st century saw this fragile alliance violently tested as coordinated law enforcement crackdowns by both the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the FBI began to unravel the cross-border network, sending shockwaves through the underworld. The Papaglias, once the undisputed lords of Hamilton's criminal underworld, had long maintained a tacit understanding with the Buffalo crime family. Johnny Pops, Papaglia, a figure both feared and respected, wielded immense power and influence over Ontario's illicit economy. His reign was marked by ruthless efficiency and a strict code of silence, allowing the family to operate with impunity for decades. Alongside the Papaglias, the Musitano family, with deep Calabrian roots and ties to Buffalo, had carved out their own sphere of influence. Together, these families represented the Canadian extension of the Buffalo Mafia's reach. However, this veneer of control began to crack under the relentless pressure of joint FBI-RCMP investigations. Using advanced surveillance technologies, informants, and extensive wiretapping, law enforcement agencies targeted the entire network, focusing on the family's drug trafficking routes, money laundering operations, and violent enforcement tactics. The collaboration between U.S. and Canadian authorities was a turning point, a recognition that organized crime was no longer constrained by borders and required a unified response. The Papaglia family's downfall was both sudden and brutal. Johnny Papaglia, once thought untouchable, was murdered in 1997 in a hit that shocked the criminal world. The killing was emblematic of the shifting tides in organized crime, old guards falling victim to new rivalries and internal betrayals. Papaglia's death left a power vacuum that sparked violent struggles within Hamilton's underworld, further destabilizing the region. Law enforcement capitalized on this chaos, ramping up arrests and prosecutions that severely weakened the family's structure. Simultaneously, the Musitano family faced its own crises. Members were arrested on charges ranging from extortion to murder, their operations hampered by a wave of indictments that chipped away at their core. The RCMP's focused efforts, combined with the FBI's cross-border initiatives, created a pincer movement that squeezed the Musitanos from all sides. Informants came forward, cooperation increased, and the once tightly knit family found itself besieged. The ripple effects of these takedowns reverberated across the Buffalo crime family. With their Canadian allies destabilized, Buffalo's influence in Ontario waned significantly. Drug routes once protected and facilitated by the Papalias and Nusitanos were disrupted, forcing Buffalo operators to reassess their strategies. The once seamless integration of criminal enterprises across the border faced fragmentation, mistrust, and intensified law enforcement scrutiny. Within Buffalo itself, the atmosphere grew tense. The family's leadership understood that the Canadian takedowns threatened not only their economic interests but also their reputation and power. The alliance had been a cornerstone of the family's strength, a reliable extension of their reach. Now, that foundation was crumbling, leaving Buffalo exposed and vulnerable. Law enforcement success in Canada emboldened U.S. agencies to intensify their efforts domestically. FBI task forces, inspired by the cross-border cooperation, launched aggressive investigations into Buffalo's activities. Surveillance increased, informants infiltrated ranks, and indictments followed. High-profile arrests of key members disrupted operations and sowed mistrust within the family. Yet, despite these setbacks, the Buffalo crime family demonstrated resilience. Adaptation became essential. Leadership restructured operations, shifting focus back onto American territory, exploring new illicit markets, and tightening internal discipline to prevent further infiltrations. The family sought to insulate itself, wary of vulnerabilities exposed by the Canadian crackdowns. The human cost of this law enforcement offensive was profound. Communities once under the Mafia's sway grappled with uncertainty, some hopeful for liberation from criminal control, others fearful of the violent power struggles that ensued in the vacuum left behind. Families mourned lost members, informants, lived under the shadow of retribution. The underworld's code of silence fractured, exposing the brutal realities beneath the glamorous facade. This chapter of the Buffalo crime family's history highlights the complex and evolving nature of organized crime in a borderless era. The collaboration between the FBI and RCMP represented a decisive blow against decades of unchecked power, demonstrating that even the most entrenched criminal empires are vulnerable to coordinated, persistent pressure. Yet, it also revealed the adaptive nature of the Mafia. Though weakened, the family endured, recalibrated, and persisted. The takedowns across the border were not an end but a painful transformation, a forcing of change upon an empire built on shadows and silence. As this chapter closes, the viewer is left with the stark image of a criminal world caught between past glories and uncertain futures. The Buffalo crime family's cross-border operations, once a symbol of dominance and unity, had been fractured by relentless law enforcement. It is a story of power challenged, alliances shattered, and the relentless pursuit of justice crossing not just city streets, but entire nations. Chapter 22. The final sit-downs. As the 20th century drew to a close, the Buffalo crime family found itself at a crossroads, a fading relic of a once formidable empire, grappling with the inexorable changes sweeping through organized crime across America. The late 1990s were marked by whispered conversations in smoke-filled back rooms, furtive meetings behind closed doors, and the careful orchestration of what would become known as the final sit-downs. These were moments of fragile diplomacy between Buffalo's remaining leaders and the powerful families of New York, a tacit acknowledgement that the old order was shifting, and survival depended on new alliances, new understandings, and a reluctant acceptance of diminished stature. At the center of these quiet negotiations stood Joseph Tadaro Sr., the aging patriarch whose reign had steered the Buffalo family through decades of upheaval, law enforcement crackdowns, and internal strife. Tadaro's name was both respected and feared in the underworld, emblematic of a leadership style that prized discretion over spectacle, stability over expansion. Yet, even he could not shield the family from the realities that loomed large, an era defined not by bold conquests, but by careful preservation. The sit-downs, reported sporadically by federal informants and pieced together by law enforcement surveillance, were emblematic of a mafia landscape profoundly altered from the days of open wars and ruthless power grabs. Gone were the times when families fought vicious battles to claim territory or dominance. Instead, there was a growing recognition that peace, however uneasy, was necessary for survival. These meetings were less about expansion and more about coexistence, about carving out spheres of influence without provoking destructive conflict. Buffalo, once a proud and powerful independent force, now found itself in a subordinate position relative to the dominant New York families, the Genovese, Gambino, Bonanno, and Colombo. The balance of power had shifted decisively. In these final sit-downs, the Tadaros sought to maintain autonomy, while acknowledging the overarching authority of their larger neighbors. The discussions revolved around mutual respect, shared interests, and the practicalities of cohabiting in an increasingly squeezed criminal ecosystem. Rumors circulated that these gatherings also served as a prelude to Joseph Tadaro Sr.'s retirement, a quiet passing of the torch rather than a dramatic overthrow. The transition of power was a delicate matter. Tadaro Jr., long groomed for leadership, was poised to step forward, but his ascension was shadowed by uncertainty and speculation. Would he command the same respect and control? Could he steer a weakened family through the challenges ahead? The atmosphere surrounding these final sit-downs was tense, marked by a mix of nostalgia, pragmatism, and underlying unease. For many within the Buffalo crime family, it was a sobering recognition that their days of independence and influence were numbered. The sit-downs were a negotiation not only of territory and operations, but of identity, an attempt to preserve dignity amid inevitable decline. Law enforcement closely monitored these meetings, recognizing their significance. The discussions revealed the intricate web of relationships and power dynamics that continued to govern organized crime, even as the Mafia's public profile diminished. These gatherings were a testament to the Mafia's enduring emphasis on order, protocol, and the maintenance of a code, values that persisted even in the face of mounting external pressures. The sit-downs also highlighted the adaptability of the Mafia. Though beset by internal weaknesses and external threats, the families sought to avoid open warfare that would only hasten their demise. Instead, they embraced negotiation and cooperation, a tacit understanding that their survival depended on mutual restraint. For the communities affected by the Buffalo crime family's operations, these final sit-downs were largely invisible, quiet, clandestine exchanges far removed from the violence and intimidation of earlier decades. Yet, their consequences were profound. The agreements reached shaped the distribution of illicit enterprises, the management of labor rackets, and the allocation of territories that would define the underworld structure into the new millennium. As Joseph Tadaro Sr. prepared to step back, the family faced a critical juncture. The choices made during these final sit-downs would determine not only who wielded power, but how the Buffalo crime family would navigate a world where the old rules no longer applied. The delicate dance between tradition and adaptation was underway. With uncertain outcomes, this chapter serves as a poignant reflection on the twilight of an era. The final sit-downs represent both an end and a beginning, a closing of a chapter on the Buffalo crime family's storied past, and the tentative emergence of a new order shaped by pragmatism, negotiation, and the relentless forces of change. As the scene fades, the viewer is left with the image of a once mighty family quietly conceding its place in a transformed landscape, a family striving to survive, not through force, but through the careful art of diplomacy and the enduring bonds of loyalty, even as the shadows of the past lengthen and the future remains uncertain. Chapter 23. The Disappearance of a Family. By the early years of the 21st century, the Buffalo crime family had, in many official eyes, become a relic of a bygone era. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, after decades of surveillance, arrests, and prosecutions, quietly classified the family as inactive. The once powerful syndicate that had shaped Buffalo's underworld and extended its reach into Canada was now considered a shadow fading into history. Yet, beneath the surface of this declaration, questions lingered, questions about whether the family had truly disappeared, or if, instead, It had simply adapted, retreated, and concealed itself in new forms. The official narrative was straightforward. Years of law enforcement pressure, combined with changing social and economic conditions, had effectively dismantled the Buffalo crime family's traditional operations. The rise of new criminal groups, the shrinking of Mafia influence nationwide, and the relentless pursuit by federal agents had eroded the family's ranks and resources. By labeling them inactive, the FBI was signaling the end of a violent and entrenched chapter in American organized crime. But such a statement belies the complex realities beneath. The Mafia, especially families like Buffalo's, had never been solely defined by overt criminal acts or public displays of power. Its true strength lay in its ability to evolve, to hide in plain sight, to transform its methods, and to influence communities through subtle networks of loyalty, corruption, and fear. The question remained, had the Buffalo family truly vanished? Or had it merely gone underground? Historically, the Buffalo crime family had thrived on integration into legitimate industries, construction, labor unions, waste management, providing a veil behind which illicit activities flourished. This dual existence blurred the lines between legal business and criminal enterprise, making detection difficult and prosecution elusive. Even as overt violence declined, influence in these sectors endured. The family's survival depended on its capacity to maintain these connections, often quietly and without fanfare. The early 2000s saw the Tadaro family, who had long led Buffalo's Mafia, continuing this trend. Joseph Tadaro Jr., inheriting the mantle from his father, was known more as a businessman than a mobster, a figure who cultivated a respectable public image while operating in the shadows. Under his guidance, the family appeared to emphasize discretion, avoiding the violent turf wars that had once defined organized crime. The shift towards a low-profile, business-first approach was a deliberate strategy to evade law enforcement and public scrutiny. Yet, reports and investigations occasionally surfaced, hinting that the family's reach had not entirely vanished. Indictments of lower-level associates, rumors of continued involvement in gambling rings, loan sharking, and union influence suggested a muted but persistent presence. Informants occasionally spoke of meetings, payments, and threats, signs of an underlying structure still active in certain quarters. Moreover, the Buffalo crime family's connections to other Mafia families in New York and Canada, though diminished, remained significant. Alliances and rivalries did not simply dissipate, they evolved, reconfiguring the landscape of organized crime. In this shifting world, the Buffalo family's role became more clandestine, perhaps operating as a satellite or subcontractor in the wider Mafia network rather than an independent powerhouse. The family's disappearance from headlines and law enforcement priority lists may have been less a sign of true extinction than of successful camouflage. The criminal underworld, like any resilient ecosystem, adapts to threats and changes. The Mafia's enduring code of silence, loyalty, and secrecy has often shielded it from full exposure, allowing it to endure beyond what public perception might suggest. For the communities once held under the Buffalo crime family's influence, this ambiguity is both a relief and a source of unease. While the violence and intimidation of the past have largely receded, the persistent whisper of Mafia influence, whether real or perceived, continues to shape local politics, labor relations, and business dealings. The shadow of organized crime is difficult to fully eradicate. Law enforcement officials remain vigilant, recognizing that inactive does not necessarily mean defunct. The possibility that the family exists in a dormant state, ready to re-emerge should opportunity arise, is a constant concern. The modern Mafia's emphasis on invisibility complicates efforts to fully dismantle these networks. The disappearance of the Buffalo crime family is thus not a simple story of defeat or dissolution, but a complex narrative of survival, adaptation, and concealment. It reflects the broader trajectory of organized crime in America, where the visible clashes of the mid-20th century give way to quieter, more insidious forms of power. As this chapter closes, the viewer is left with a haunting Question: what does it mean for a family to disappear? Is it the end of influence, or merely a transformation into something less recognizable but no less potent? The Buffalo crime family story suggests that even in apparent absence, shadows endure, and the legacy of power, however hidden, remains. The disappearance is less a conclusion than an invitation to look deeper, to question official narratives, and to understand that the Mafia's story is one of persistence, layered complexity, and enduring influence, even when the spotlight has moved on. Chapter 24: Canada Burns. Mob hits in Hamilton. The 2010s erupted as a violent and turbulent decade in the shadows of Canada's underworld. Hamilton, a city long known as a hub for organized crime, became the epicenter of a brutal mob war that would expose deep-rooted ties to Buffalo's Mafia past. This era, marked by brazen murders, shifting alliances, and unrelenting violence, shattered any illusions that the cross-border criminal legacy had faded. Instead, it laid bare the enduring, volatile nature of the Mafia's presence, with flames of conflict consuming old alliances and rewriting the rules of power. The city of Hamilton had always been a strategic prize, a gateway between Canada and the United States, fertile ground for smuggling, racketeering, and illicit enterprise. For decades, the Papalia and Musitano families had ruled these streets with a mix of iron-fisted control and calculated diplomacy, their influence extending far beyond the city's limits. Their connection to the Buffalo crime family was not merely historical, it was foundational. Cross-border collaborations had cemented a criminal network that thrived on shared interests and mutual protection. But by the 2010s, this fragile balance had shattered. The Musitano family, once a formidable force allied with Buffalo's Mafia, found itself embroiled in violent power struggles that would decimate its ranks and ignite a series of targeted killings that shocked both sides of the border. The murders of key Musitano figures reverberated throughout the Canadian and American underworlds. Angelo Musitano, a charismatic and ruthless leader, was assassinated in 2017 outside his home, a hit that sent shockwaves through Hamilton's criminal circles. Less than 2 years later, his brother Pat Musitano met a similar fate. These murders were not random acts of violence, but calculated strikes designed to dismantle the family's hold and send a stark message to allies and rivals alike. Investigations into the killings revealed a tangled web of motives: old grudges, betrayal, and competition for control over lucrative enterprises. The violence was a brutal assertion of dominance, an unrelenting purge aimed at erasing the Musitano legacy. Yet, beneath the surface, law enforcement uncovered something deeper: the persistence of long-standing connections between Hamilton's crime families and the Buffalo Mafia. These ties, forged in the mid-20th century and nurtured through decades of cooperation, were not easily severed. The Buffalo crime family's influence in Ontario had endured, often operating quietly in the background even as overt power shifted between Canadian factions. The mob hits of the 2010s illuminated this shadowy partnership, revealing that Buffalo's reach had never fully retracted but instead had adapted, supporting allies and manipulating events from behind the scenes. The decade's violence also underscored the shifting dynamics within the Canadian underworld. New players, including international drug cartels and street gangs, challenged the traditional mafia families, injecting volatility and unpredictability. The old codes of conduct, once the mafia's protective cloak, were fraying under this pressure. Retribution became swift and merciless, and the boundary between allies and enemies blurred to Hamilton streets, once controlled by carefully negotiated agreements, became battlegrounds. Shootings, bombings, and public executions shattered the city's uneasy calm. The Musitano murders were emblematic of this chaos, a stark symbol of a world where loyalty was transient and survival demanded ruthless resolve. For the Buffalo crime family, these events were a reminder of both legacy and vulnerability. The long-standing alliance with the Musitanos meant that the ripples of violence across the border impacted Buffalo's own operations and standing. It exposed fault lines in their once solid relationships and challenged their ability to influence events beyond their immediate territory. Law enforcement agencies on both sides intensified their focus, using the turmoil to deepen investigations into the intertwined criminal networks. Cross-border cooperation between the FBI and RCMP strengthened, reflecting the recognition that organized crime's reach was transnational and required coordinated response. The human toll of this mob war was profound. Families torn apart by violence, communities gripped by fear, and a city's sense of security shattered. The cycle of retaliation showed no signs of abating, leaving scars that would linger for years. The spectacle of Hamilton's burning underworld was a harsh reminder of the costs hidden beneath the Mafia's code of silence. As this chapter draws to a close, the viewer is confronted with the stark reality of organized crime's persistence. Its ability to ignite old wounds and fuel new conflicts across generations and borders. The burning streets of Hamilton are not just scenes of violence, but testimonies to the enduring legacy of the Buffalo crime family and its Canadian partners, a legacy fraught with power, betrayal, and unrelenting struggle. This chapter is a vivid testament to the truth that, despite law enforcement's efforts and public declarations of decline, the Mafia's embers still glow, capable of igniting flames that consume cities and rewrite histories. The story of the 2010s mob hits in Hamilton is a powerful, sobering reflection on how the past continues to shape the present, and how the shadows of crime reach far beyond any single city or nation. Chapter 25. The Legacy of the Magaddinos. For over 70 years, the name Magaddino has been etched into the history of organized crime across the northeastern United States and into Canada, a symbol of power, influence, and a complex legacy that continues to reverberate today. The Buffalo crime family, under the steady and iron-fisted leadership of Stefano Magaddino and his successors, became more than a criminal organization. It became a cultural force, deeply intertwined with the communities it touched, and a testament to the durability of Mafia influence even amid relentless pressures and changing times. The origins of this legacy trace back to Stefano Magaddino's arrival in Buffalo, where his Sicilian roots and sharp strategic mind propelled the family into a position of dominance. He was a man of contradictions, a quiet, almost unassuming figure to some, yet a ruthless and calculating boss to others. His reign shaped not only the criminal underworld, but also the social and economic fabric of Buffalo and its surrounding regions. The Magaddinos were architects of a vast network that spanned cities, crossed international borders, and infiltrated legitimate enterprises with surgical precision. The Magaddino's approach to power was rooted in both tradition and adaptation. He understood the importance of secrecy and loyalty, but also recognized the necessity of evolving with the times. This balance allowed the family to survive, and often thrive, through decades marked by violent rivalries, law enforcement crackdowns, and shifting criminal landscapes. From controlling labor unions and construction rackets to managing illegal gambling and drug trafficking routes, the family's influence was both deep and wide. The reach of the Magaddinos extended well beyond Buffalo's city limits. Their expansion into Canada, particularly Ontario and the Hamilton area, forged a cross-border alliance that shaped organized crime on a continental scale. These connections with Canadian families, such as the Papalias and Musitanos, created a transnational syndicate capable of coordinating complex operations while evading law enforcement scrutiny. This international presence was a hallmark of the family's strategic vision and a key component of their longevity. Yet, the Magaddino legacy is not solely one of power and criminal enterprise. It is also a story of cultural impact, a reflection of the immigrant experience, community ties, and the complicated relationship between the Mafia and the neighborhoods it both protected and exploited. For many Italian-American families in Buffalo, the Mafia represented both fear and familiarity, violence and patronage. The family's influence extended into everyday life, the businesses they controlled, the jobs they provided, and the unspoken rules they enforced. This duality created a layered legacy. On one hand, the family's reign brought intimidation and corruption, perpetuating cycles of crime and injustice. On the other, it fostered a sense of identity and belonging within marginalized communities, where the Mafia was sometimes seen as a protector against external threats. The Magaddinos occupied this paradox with a deftness that allowed them to embed themselves in the social fabric, blurring the lines between villainy and survival. Throughout the decades, the family's leadership changed hands, but the core values instilled by Stefano Magaddino endured. Joseph Tadaro Sr. and later Joseph Tadaro Jr. carried forward the mantle, steering the family through the late 20th century with a measured, business-first approach that emphasized discretion and control over spectacle. This evolution reflected broader trends in organized crime, where visibility often translated into vulnerability. Despite law enforcement's best efforts to dismantle the family, the Magaddino name persisted as a symbol of resilience. Their operations became more clandestine, their methods more sophisticated, but their influence remained. The family adapted to new challenges, the rise of street gangs, shifting drug markets, and increased surveillance, by embedding themselves ever deeper into legitimate sectors, maintaining a quiet but firm grip on power. The cultural imprint of the Magaddinos is visible even today in Buffalo's neighborhoods, where stories of their reign are passed down through generations, sometimes whispered, sometimes boldly recounted. The legacy manifests in local lore, the architecture of neighborhoods once dominated by Mafia influence, and the lingering mistrust of institutions perceived as entwined with organized crime that in Canada, too. The echoes of the Magaddino era resonate. The violent upheavals of recent decades, the mob wars in Hamilton, the targeted killings of the Musitano family, are in many ways extensions of alliances and rivalries forged long ago. The cross-border nature of the family's operations created a web of relationships that continue to influence organized crime dynamics in both countries. The legacy is not without its costs. The cycles of violence, the corruption of institutions, and the exploitation of communities remain dark stains on the family's history. But it is precisely this complexity that makes the story of the Magaddinos compelling and significant, not just as a tale of crime, but as a mirror reflecting the interplay of power, identity, and survival in the American and Canadian experience. This documentary series comes to its close. It is clear that the Magaddino legacy transcends headlines and indictments. It is a story woven into the very fabric of the regions they dominated, a testament to the enduring nature of organized crime when it learns to blend with legitimate society. The Buffalo crime family saga is a reminder that history is rarely black and white, but filled with shadows and contradictions. In the end, the Magaddino name stands as both a warning and a lesson of how power can root itself deeply in communities, how influence can persist through adaptation, and how the ghosts of the past continue to shape the present. Their story is far from over, not in the sensationalism of the media, but in the quiet legacies left behind, the lasting marks on cities, families, and the hidden corners of society where the lines between right and wrong blur. This is the lasting imprint of the Magaddinos, a legacy defined by power, resilience, and complexity, a story that continues to echo across generations and borders, challenging us to understand the shadows that lurk beneath the surface of history. Chapter 26: Shadows in Modern Buffalo. In the heart of Buffalo today, the echoes of an era long past linger like whispers in a hollowed room, faint, elusive, but unmistakably present. The city, once a stronghold of the formidable Buffalo crime family, now wears the marks of transformation. The thunderous footsteps of the old guard have faded, replaced by a stillness that borders on silence. Yet, beneath the surface of everyday life, shadows persist, ghost remnants of a once mighty empire, subtle traces of influence that hint at the family's enduring, if diminished, presence. Modern Buffalo has evolved, its skyline reshaped by economic change and urban renewal. Yet, The undercurrents of organized crime continue to flow beneath its streets, in pockets less visible to the public eye and law enforcement alike. The Buffalo crime family, declared inactive by many, refuses to be entirely consigned to history. Instead, it exists as a shadow network, a hidden architecture of power, suspicion, and unspoken control. The contemporary landscape of Buffalo's organized crime is marked by contradictions. On one hand, there is a conspicuous absence of the overt violence, open racketeering, and public confrontations that once characterized mafia activity. Gone are the days of loud, brutal turf wars and brazen displays of dominance. In their place, a new modus operandi has emerged: subtlety, discretion, and invisibility. The family's methods have adapted to a modern world where surveillance is constant and the consequences of exposure are more severe. Still, investigators and insiders alike note the presence of suspected rackets that bear the hallmarks of mafia involvement. These are not the sprawling criminal empires of decades ago, but more contained operations: illegal gambling rings hidden behind storefront facades, loan sharking that remains veiled in shadows, and labor union infiltration that continues in quieter, less detectable ways. These enterprises may be smaller in scale, but they carry the weight of legacy and influence. Law enforcement faces significant challenges in untangling this web of modern crime. The family's low profile, combined with tight-knit community ties, and the enduring code of silence, complicate efforts to penetrate the veil. Informants are scarce, and witnesses hesitant, caught between fear and loyalty. The Buffalo crime family's survival depends on this discretion, the ability to wield power without attracting unwanted attention. Moreover, the family's historical connections to legitimate business provide a dual layer of protection. Ownership stakes in construction firms, waste management companies, and other industries offer both cover and profit, blending illicit activity with lawful enterprise. This mingling obscures the lines between criminal and legitimate income, complicating prosecution and enforcement. The community's relationship with the remnants of the mafia is complex. For some, the mafia is a relic of oppression and violence, a source of fear and hardship. For others, it represents a familiar, if troubling, thread woven into the fabric of local identity. A cautionary tale as well as a symbol of survival in a city that has faced economic decline and social challenges. This duality creates an atmosphere of tacit acceptance and muted resistance, a nuanced coexistence with shadow power. Recent decades have also seen new criminal elements emerge in Buffalo, including street gangs and drug networks, which challenge the traditional mafia's dominance. These groups operate with different codes, different styles, often more violent, less restrained by the old rules. The Buffalo crime family's diminished role in this changing ecosystem reflects broader shifts in organized crime nationally, where decentralized and diversified groups increasingly fill the voids once controlled by mafia families. Yet, the mafia's ghosts remain influential. Their legacy shapes how power is brokered in Buffalo's criminal underworld. Allegiances are forged in the shadows, deals made quietly in back rooms rather than on street corners. The family's historical stature affords it a residual respect, a caution that tempers the ambitions of upstarts and rivals. Even in retreat, the Magaddino name commands weight. This lingering presence also manifests in the ongoing investigations and occasional arrests that surface periodically, reminders that while the family's overt power may have waned, its structures have not vanished entirely. Each case reveals fragments of the broader tapestry: hidden hierarchies, complex money flows, and the persistent code of silence that shields the family. For law enforcement, the task is daunting. The modern Buffalo crime family is not a monolith to be toppled, but a subtle force to be unraveled, one that requires patience, intelligence, and a deep understanding of history and community dynamics. The battle against this hidden power is fought not only in courtrooms and raids, but in the slow, painstaking work of penetrating decades of secrecy. The human cost of this enduring shadow is profound. Communities caught between fear and loyalty live with the consequences of compromised justice, economic exploitation, and the lingering threat of violence. The Mafia's quiet grip distorts opportunities, limits progress, and perpetuates cycles of influence that resist easy resolution. As this chapter closes, the viewer is invited to reflect on the paradox of modern organized crime in Buffalo, a world where silence speaks volumes, and power is wielded not with guns blazing, but with whispered influence and concealed control. The Buffalo crime family, once a roaring force, now exists in the penumbra, its shadows long, its presence subtle, but its impact undeniable. This is the story of a family that never truly vanished, but transformed, surviving in the spaces between light and darkness, reminding us that history is not just what we see, but what endures unseen beneath the surface. Chapter 27. The Last Dawn of the Falls. Joseph Tadaro Jr. is a figure wrapped in contradictions, a man whose life straddles the line between the legitimate and the clandestine, between respectability and suspicion. Often described as the alleged last boss of the Buffalo crime family, Tadaro Jr. has carved a unique place in the modern mafia narrative, not through violent showdowns or notorious headlines, but through a quieter, more subtle assertion of power. His story is one of transformation, survival, and the enduring complexities of organized crime in a changing world. Born into a family with deep mafia roots, Joseph Tadaro Jr. inherited more than just a name. His father, Joseph Tadaro Sr., had been a steady hand guiding the Buffalo crime family through decades of turmoil and transition. From a young age, Tadaro Jr. was groomed not for the violent theatrics of his predecessors, but for a different kind of leadership, one centered on business acumen, discretion, and adaptability. The Tadaro name became synonymous with legitimate enterprise in Buffalo's public eye. Joseph Jr. built a reputation as a businessman and restaurateur, investing in well-known establishments and community ventures. His presence was less about intimidation and more about integration, a figure seemingly at home in boardrooms and banquet halls rather than back alleys and clandestine meetings. This cultivated image served as both shield and strategy, blurring the lines between lawful success and alleged illicit influence. Despite his business persona, law enforcement and organized crime experts have long viewed Tadaro Jr. as the linchpin of Buffalo's mafia legacy, a man who quietly maintained control over traditional rackets while projecting an air of respectability. Investigations have linked him to illegal gambling operations, loan sharking, and labor union manipulation, though concrete convictions have been elusive. The Tadaro family's ability to operate beneath the radar is a testament to their careful navigation of power's shifting currents. Tadaro Jr.'s leadership style contrasts sharply with the flamboyance and violence often associated with mafia dons of the past. There are no public displays of ruthlessness, no notorious trials emblazoned across headlines. Instead, his reign is marked by patience, subtlety, and a keen understanding of the evolving criminal landscape. In a world where exposure can mean downfall, Tadaro Jr. mastered the art of invisibility. His influence extends beyond mere criminal enterprise. Tadaro Jr. occupies a complicated space within Buffalo's social and economic fabric. His business ventures provide jobs and economic activity, earning him a degree of local respect and legitimacy. Simultaneously, rumors persist of his involvement in underground dealings, perpetuating a duality that has defined the Buffalo crime family for generations. This delicate balance is not without risk. Tadaro Jr. has faced scrutiny from federal investigations, grand juries, and informants, yet has managed to evade serious legal consequences. This resilience fuels both fascination and frustration among observers, highlighting the challenges law enforcement faces when confronting organized crime that embraces discretion over spectacle. The community's perception of Tadaro Jr. is equally nuanced. To some, he is a successful businessman and community figure, a testament to perseverance and adaptability. To others, he represents the lingering shadow of Mafia influence, a reminder that beneath the veneer of progress and legitimacy, old power structures endure. This dual image reflects the complex interplay of fear, loyalty, and acceptance that surrounds the Mafia in Buffalo. His story also underscores the broader evolution of organized crime in America. The era of open warfare and dramatic power struggles has given way to a more covert and corporatized form of criminal enterprise. Tadaro Jr. embodies this shift, a leader who wields power not with guns, but with contracts and connections, who governs through influence rather than intimidation. Yet, despite his low profile, Tadaro Jr.'s role as the last Don of the Falls carries symbolic weight. He represents the end of a chapter, a final steward of a family that once commanded a sprawling empire stretching from Buffalo to Canada. His tenure marks the transition from an era of overt Mafia dominance to one of shadowy persistence that I am examining. His life, one sees a portrait of a man shaped by legacy and circumstance, navigating the treacherous waters of family expectation and modern law enforcement. Joseph Tadaro Jr. is both product and architect of a changing Mafia, an organization adapting to survive in a world that no longer tolerates its old ways. As this chapter concludes, the viewer is left with the image of a man balancing on the precipice between light and darkness, legitimacy and illegality, past and future. The last Don of the Falls is a figure who, in his silence and subtlety, speaks volumes about the enduring power and complexity of the Buffalo crime family story. Chapter 28. The Forgotten Commission Boss. Stefano Magaddino was a man who once sat with kings. Yet, in the annals of organized crime history, his name often drifts into the shadows, overshadowed by more notorious figures whose stories capture the public imagination. This final chapter is a reflection on the legacy of a man who ruled not with spectacle, but with quiet authority. A boss whose influence shaped the Mafia not only in Buffalo, but across an entire continent, and whose story deserves to be remembered in full, not as an afterthought, but as a cornerstone of Mafia history. Born in Castellammarese del Golfo, Sicily, Magaddino carried with him the weight of a Sicilian bloodline steeped in tradition and loyalty. His journey from the old country to the streets of Buffalo was emblematic of countless immigrants seeking a new life. But Stefano's path diverged into realms few dared to tread. He was a man forged by hardship and ambition, his eyes set on creating a lasting empire in a foreign land. Magaddino's rise was not marked by flamboyance or headline-grabbing violence. Instead, it was a steady accumulation of power through careful alliances, strategic patience, and an unyielding will. He built a criminal enterprise that controlled labor unions, gambling, narcotics, and legitimate businesses, all under a veil of secrecy. His was a reign of shadow, where strength was measured not by public battles, but by unseen control. As a founding member of the Mafia Commission, Magaddino occupied a rarefied position. The Commission was the ruling council of American organized crime, an assembly of the most powerful families who negotiated disputes, set rules, and shared territories. In this exclusive circle, Magaddino was not merely a participant. He was a kingmaker, a force shaping the underworld's future during its most formative years. Yet, despite this prominence, history has often overlooked Magaddino's role. Compared to figures like Lucky Luciano or Vito Genovese, his name is less well known, his story less told. This neglect belies the profound impact he wielded over organized crime's evolution, particularly in the often ignored regions of Buffalo and Canada, where his influence was paramount. Part of this obscurity stems from Magaddino's leadership style. Unlike some of his contemporaries, he avoided the limelight and refrained from unnecessary violence. His power was quiet but absolute, earned through respect and fear, loyalty and ruthlessness. This discretion, while effective, meant fewer sensational stories for the press and fewer trials for the courts, resulting in a quieter legacy that history has struggled to capture. Moreover, Magaddino's empire was deeply intertwined with immigrant communities, providing a complicated blend of protection, opportunity, and exploitation. His rule shaped the social fabric of Buffalo's Italian-American neighborhoods and extended across the border into Canada, forging alliances and rivalries that reverberate to this day. Understanding his legacy requires recognizing this duality, how a criminal empire could simultaneously bind and fracture communities. His tenure also highlights the Mafia's adaptability. Magaddino's ability to navigate the shifting landscapes of Prohibition, post-war America, and the rise of federal law enforcement illustrates a leader attuned to survival. He understood when to consolidate, when to expand, and when to retreat into silence, ensuring his family's endurance across decades. Yet, this legacy is not without darkness. The violence, corruption, and intimidation that underpinned Magaddino's rule left scars on individuals, families, and institutions. The cost of his empire was paid in blood and fear, reminders of the human toll behind the strategic calculations. As the final reflection on his life unfolds, the viewer is invited to reconsider the narrative of the Mafia's past. Stefano Magaddino was not a footnote. He was a pillar. His story challenges the tendency to glamorize or simplify organized crime, instead presenting a portrait of complexity, of a man who balanced tradition and innovation, brutality and diplomacy. The forgotten commission boss stands as a symbol of power wielded quietly, influence exerted subtly, and legacy maintained not by loud proclamation, but by enduring impact. His story calls us to remember that history is often shaped as much by those who operate in the shadows as by those who bask in the spotlight. In closing, Magaddino's life is a testament to the enduring nature of power, how it can root itself deeply, adapt across generations, and leave a mark that history, for all its biases, cannot entirely erase. To forget him is to overlook a vital chapter in the story of American organized crime, and to lose sight of the intricate forces that shaped cities, communities, and the underworld itself. This is the legacy of Stefano Magaddino, the man who sat with kings, ruled with quiet authority, and whose influence continues to echo in the shadows of Buffalo and beyond.